The deputy stood by the door because no one had told him to sit. Sleet had melted through his boots and pooled on the plank floor of the county clerk's office, and the lamp above the desk put out a smoke that stung worse than the cold outside. The clerk was folding a coat, a man's coat, heavy canvas, still holding the shape of shoulders that had been under it that morning. A brass button was missing. The lining had gone dark along one side in a way the deputy tried not to look at twice. The woman across the desk had not spoken. She held the claim papers the clerk had pulled from the coat's pocket, and her hands did not shake, which was the thing the deputy would remember later. The merchant beside the door, the one who had been waiting when they arrived, ledger already open, pen already scratched across a column, leaned forward and asked whether she planned to finish 5 years alone. Edwin Weller died on the 14th of November, 1880, 11 miles north of Broken Bow, when a loaded lumber wagon shifted on a frozen grade and rolled. The front axle caught his chest between the sideboards and the ground. He was 26 years old. He had been hauling oak planks for the barn he had not finished, on a road he had traveled 40 times without incident, in weather that was cold but not yet dangerous. The horse that survived stood in the traces for 2 hours before a freighter found it. Beret reached the cabin that evening carrying Edwin's coat, the claim papers from his pocket, and the knowledge that Merritt Sloan had already taken the second horse as security against the lumber debt. The coat still held the shape of Edwin's shoulders. A brass button had broken loose during the accident. She set it on the table beside the lamp and did not touch it again for 7 years. She was 23 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall. Her ribs on the left side were bruised from a fall she had taken helping Edwin load the wagon that morning, the same load that killed him 4 hours later. She could not lift her left arm above her shoulder without a sound leaving her teeth. The claim was 160 acres of Custer County grassland with a 16 by 20-foot frame cabin, 12 cultivated acres, 1 milk cow, 2 pigs, and 17 hens. The barn stood half-framed. The roof faced broadside to the north wind because Edwin had oriented it for summer convenience, not winter survival. The walls were single-board pine with mud chinking that had already cracked in 3 places. Beret had $41.60 in a tin behind the flour. She owed $213, $147 to Sloan's store for lumber, nails, and feed advanced on credit. $38 to the freighter who had delivered the pine boards. $28 for Edwin's burial, because the ground was already hard and the grave digger charged by the hour. 3 1/4 cords of firewood stood stacked against the east wall of the cabin. An exposed house on open prairie, poorly sealed with the roof oriented to catch the full force of northern wind, could burn 8 cords in a severe winter. She was short nearly 5 cords before December had begun. The nearest reliable timber stood 11 miles south along the river breaks. The one horse Sloan had left her was a 12-year-old mare with a swollen hock that could not pull a full load uphill. Beret could drag Deadfall by hand, but a woman with bruised ribs hauling branches across frozen grass would not collect 5 cords before spring. The Homestead Act required 5 years of continuous residence before the claim became hers. Edwin had filed in 1879. 3 years remained. If Beret abandoned the cabin, the claim reverted. Sloan, who held the debt and owned the adjacent quarter section, had already asked whether she planned to finish 5 years alone. The question had not been casual. She could not leave. She had no fare east. No surviving relatives willing to take in a widow carrying $213 of prairie debt. The claim was the only property she owned or would ever own, and it was not yet hers. Walking away meant losing the land, the cabin, the 3 years Edwin had already invested, and every dollar sunk into boards and seed and broken ground. She She would arrive wherever she went with nothing except the bruised ribs and the broken brass button. 4 years of residence, 5 cords short every winter. $41 against 213 owed. 1 weak horse, 1 woman, 1 cabin built wrong. That was the arithmetic. Nobody who understood it expected her to last until February. Sheriff Tobias Kern rode onto the Weller claim 6 days after Edwin's death. He was 47, a former cattle foreman and winter freighter who had spent 11 years moving livestock and supplies across the central Nebraska plains. He had recovered frozen bodies. He knew what killed exposed settlers, and the list was not complicated. Insufficient fuel, insufficient shelter, insufficient sense to leave when both ran out. He did not come to offer sympathy. He came because the county required an inventory when a claimant died to determine whether the surviving party could maintain residence or whether the property should be flagged for abandonment. Kern dismounted and walked the property the way a man inspects a horse he expects to put down. He started at the barn. "Half a frame," he said. "No south wall, no door. The hay you stored is already wet." He moved to the woodpile and counted. 3 cords, maybe 3 1/4 if you split the knotted pieces. He pressed his boot against the bottom row and watched 2 logs shift. Stacked loose. You will lose a 1/4 cord to rot if it rains before it freezes. He walked the cabin's north wall and pressed his palm flat against the boards. Wind moved through the chinking gaps hard enough to shift the hair on his wrist. "A roof built broadside to the north," Kern said. He looked at Beret the way doctors look at patients who do not yet understand the diagnosis. "Mrs. Weller, I have seen wind push snow through a keyhole. I have seen it backdraft a chimney hard enough to fill a cabin with smoke in 30 seconds. This house is not sealed, it is not oriented, and you do not have enough wood to keep a fire past January, even if every joint were tight." Beret stood with her arms crossed against her ribs. She did not argue. She had already done the arithmetic. Kern told her plainly she needed 5 additional cords minimum, or she needed to leave the cabin before the deep cold arrived. He could arrange temporary shelter at a ranch south of Broken Bow. The claim would wait. The weather would not. "I am not leaving," Beret said. "Then you need wood," Kern said. 5 cords, and someone to haul it, and a month you do not have. He wrote his assessment in the county ledger. Claimant present, structure inadequate, fuel critically short, advised departure, claimant declined. Kern mounted and turned his horse toward the road. He paused and looked back at the cabin, the single-board walls, the half-barn, the crooked stovepipe leaning 2 degrees east. "Your husband built this place for summer," Kern said. "Winter does not negotiate." He rode south. He expected to return in the spring to file the abandonment papers. Merritt Sloan arrived before Kern's dust had settled. Sloan was 44, the largest merchant and lumber dealer in Broken Bow. He sold pine boards, nails, wire, flour, and credit, and all 5 commodities flowed in a single direction toward settlers who could not pay until their claims proved out. When claims failed, Sloan acquired the improvements at a fraction of their cost. He had assembled 4 quarter sections this way in 3 years. Edwin Weller's debt of $147 represented to Sloan not a loss, but a down payment on 160 acres of increasingly valuable grassland. He arrived in a wagon with a ledger book in a manner so polite it pressed harder than anger. "Mrs. Weller," he said, removing his hat, "I want you to know that Edwin's account is not something I intend to press during your grief." Beret watched him. She had seen Sloan wait beside the county clerk's door on the day Edwin's coat was returned. She knew what patience looked like when it was counting. However, Sloane continued, the note is due in 90 days, $147. I have carried it without interest as a courtesy to Edwin, and I will extend the same courtesy to you, but I cannot carry it indefinitely. He looked past her at the half-built barn, the thin woodpile, the single horse standing in the broken corral with its swollen hock. I am prepared to cancel the debt, Sloane said. All of it, the lumber, the feed, the nails, in exchange for the claim. Beret said nothing. You would walk away clean, Sloane said. No debt. I would even provide passage to Omaha. You have family in Iowa, I believe. I have no family in Iowa, Beret said. Then wherever you choose. The point is that you would owe nothing and own nothing, which is better than owing everything and losing everything. This cabin will not survive what is coming. You know that as well as I do. The offer was $147 of debt cancellation for 160 acres, a cabin, 12 cultivated acres, and 3 years of Edwin's labor. Sloane would acquire a property worth 6 or 7 times the debt the moment the claim proved out. You have 10 days, Sloane said. He climbed back onto his wagon. I do not say this to threaten you, Mrs. Weller. I say it because 10 days from now, the first hard freeze will make this conversation irrelevant. You cannot heat this cabin, you cannot finish that barn, and you cannot complete 4 years of residence on $41 in a lame horse. He knew the exact amount of her cash. Beret understood then that Sloane had inventoried her situation more carefully than the sheriff. Think about it, Sloane said, and drove away. The wind picked up that evening. It came from the northwest. It found every gap in the chinking, every crack where the boards had shrunk, every place where Edwin had meant to come back and seal, but never did. The stove drew sideways. The flame leaned. A cup of water Beret set on the bench beside the north wall developed a thin skin of ice before she finished her supper. She banked the stove with the largest log she had. She slept in her coat on the floor beside the firebox, with Edwin's broken brass button in her pocket and the sound of moving air in every wall. She had survived nothing yet. The temperature that night dropped to 11 degrees above zero, which was mild. The winter that was coming would reach 36 below. Beret survived the first winter through sod banking, rationing, and proximity to fire. She cut sod blocks from the frozen edge of her broken field and stacked them against the cabin's north and west walls. The sod reduced direct air passage but did not stop it. She sealed the 2 windows with oiled canvas. She confined herself to the room with the stove and hung a wool blanket across the doorway to the lean-to, abandoning half the cabin's already small space. She burned wood continuously. She woke twice each night to feed the stove because if the fire died, the cabin temperature dropped below freezing within 40 minutes. She learned this precisely because it happened on the 3rd night of December, and she woke to frost on the blanket over her face. By January, she had burned through 2 cords. By February, 3. The remaining quarter cord would not last 2 weeks, and the nights were still reaching 20 below. She dragged deadfall from a ravine 2 miles east. The mare could not pull the makeshift sled through crusted snow, so Beret wrapped a rope across her chest and hauled bundles by hand. Each trip took 4 hours and produced enough wood for 2 days. Her bruised ribs had healed enough to work, but not enough to stop reminding her. Every pull sent a line of heat through her left side. She ate 2 meals a day: salt pork, cornbread, boiled oats. The hens stopped laying in the cold. She killed 3 for broth when the salt pork ran low. The cow produced less than a quart a day. The pigs ate scraps she could not spare and provided nothing in return until she slaughtered one in late January and hung the meat frozen from the barn frame. By March, she had burned nearly every piece of usable wood on the property, including fence rails, a broken shelf, and part of the barn framing Edwin had raised. The cabin still stood. Beret still breathed. But the winter had consumed almost everything she had, and it had been a moderate winter, not a severe one, not the kind that killed. She had proven one thing: she could endure a season through sheer attrition, sleeping beside fire, hauling wood by hand, eating less each week, shrinking her world to a single room. But attrition would not sustain 4 more winters. Each year would start with less wood, less money, less strength. The arithmetic did not improve with repetition. The temporary measures had kept her alive. They had also shown her exactly how she would eventually die. The answer arrived sideways, the way most useful knowledge does. Not as an idea, but as a contradiction she could not ignore. In late March, during a raw wind that still carried winter's edge, Beret walked the property assessing what remained. The ground was patchy with old snow. Most of the open field had been scoured clean by wind, the soil exposed and dry. But 2 places showed different patterns. Behind the half-built barn, the one solid wall Edwin had completed, a deep, hard-packed drift sat tight against the leeward side. The wind had carried snow over the top and slammed it down directly behind the wall. Within 3 feet of the boards, the snow was knee-deep and compacted hard enough to walk on. But the barn wall had not protected the ground beyond. At 10 feet, the snow disappeared entirely. The area was scoured bare. Worse, the turbulence behind the solid wall had created a swirling eddy that left the ground alternately stripped and heaped in an unpredictable mess. 40 yards farther east, an irregular thicket of wild plum had produced a completely different result. The brush was thin. Wind passed through it. But behind the thicket, a wide, shallow blanket of undisturbed snow covered the ground evenly for 30 feet or more. No scouring, no violent drifts, no eddies. The snow simply lay there, as if the wind had set it down instead of throwing it. Beret stood between the 2 patterns and looked back and forth. The solid wall had created violence. The porous brush had created calm. The observation unlocked a memory she had carried since childhood but never examined. Her mother had kept sheep on the Iowa farm. In winter, the flock sheltered behind a woven brush fence. Willow branches laced through cedar posts, full of gaps, nothing that would stop a determined dog, let alone a blizzard. But the sheep survived. They stood behind the fence in weather that should have killed exposed animals, and they survived. Beret remembered pressing her bare hand behind the fence while snow hissed over the top. The air was moving, but slowly. The snow did not hit her face. It drifted past. Her mother had pulled one branch free and told Beret to watch. The gap changed the pattern. Instead of a smooth, even deposition behind the fence, the opening created a narrow jet that carved a line in the snow. "The fence does not stop the wind," her mother had said. "It makes the wind tired." Beret had been 8 years old. She had not understood the physics. She did not need to understand the physics. She had felt the difference on her skin. Now she stood on a Nebraska claim, looking at a solid wall that created destruction and a porous thicket that created shelter, and her mother's words assembled into something she could use. The cabin did not need a wall. It needed a deep zone of slower air. She began testing the idea the same week. She drove 6 rows of stakes into the frozen ground north of the cabin. Through some rows, she wove dry grass and willow as tightly as she could, a solid barrier. Through others, she left every second or third space open. She carried stove ash in a bucket and released it into the wind, watching where it traveled. After each snowfall, she measured the drifts with Edwin's carpenter's rule, recording the depth at 1-foot intervals behind each row. The results confirmed what the plum brush had shown her. The tight rows produced steep, violent drifts directly behind the barrier, then nothing. The open rows produced longer, shallower deposits that spread the snow across a wider area. The wind slowed over depth instead of being thrown upward and crashing down. But stakes and woven grass were temporary. A Nebraska winter wind would flatten any fence she could build from available materials. What she needed was a barrier that grew stronger with each year instead of weaker. Something that could not be blown down, burned through, or consumed. She needed trees, not a wall of trees. The barn wall had proved that solid barriers created the wrong kind of protection. She needed rows of living plants, arranged with enough porosity to slow the wind without blocking it completely. The same principle as her mother's brush fence, but permanent and tall enough to protect a building. She drew the design in the dirt beside her experimental stakes. Two angled arms pointing north-northwest, because that was where the winter winds arrived most frequently. Not a narrow V that would funnel wind to a point, but a broad chevron, two barriers set at roughly 110 degrees, creating an overlapping protected zone where neither wind from the north nor wind from the northwest could reach the cabin at full force. The house would sit in the calm pocket behind the apex, surrounded by slowed air on both sides. But trees took years. Spruce grew slowly, cedar grew faster but started small. Cottonwood grew tall quickly but dropped its leaves before winter, offering only trunk and branch. A single species would not work. She needed layers. Shrubs at the bottom to close ground-level gaps, evergreens in the middle for year-round density, tall deciduous trunks behind them for height and depth. And she needed all of this to survive drought, hail, grasshoppers, rabbits, cattle, fire, and 8 years of Nebraska weather. Beret calculated the gamble. She had $41.60. A nursery order of spruce and cedar seedlings would cost at least $9. Cottonwood cuttings she could take from the river for free. Wild plum suckers grew along every draw. But the purchased stock, the evergreens that would provide winter density, would consume nearly a quarter of her remaining cash. $9.80 spent on trees was $9.80 not spent on nails, flour, salt, or the debt she owed Sloan. If the seedlings died, and most tree plantings on the Nebraska prairie did die, from drought, from neglect, from soil too dry and wind too strong, she would have wasted money she could not replace. She ordered the seedlings anyway. Lydia Oakes found Beret beside the experimental stakes on a cold April morning and did not bother with pleasantries. Lydia was 35, the wife of a farmer 2 miles east, and she had watched 2 orchards die on the Nebraska plains. She understood trees. She understood what killed them, and she understood the difference between useful work and desperate fantasy. "What are you measuring?" Lydia asked. Beret showed her the drift records, the carpenter's rule, the difference between the solid and porous test rows. Lydia listened. She looked at the stakes, the woven grass, the marked measurements in the dirt. Then she shook her head. "You are measuring snow," Lydia said, "while your fence falls down." She pointed east, where a section of Beret's property fence had collapsed under the weight of the winter's drifts. Beret had not repaired it because she had been conducting wind experiments instead. "Beret, spruce dies in this soil. I have seen it die 3 times. The roots rot. The wind strips the needles. A dry July kills what a wet spring started." "Cedar does not die as easily," Beret said. "Cedar takes 15 years to reach the height of a man. You need protection now. You need wood now. You need to fix that fence now before Sloan's cattle wander onto your claim and he charges you for the damage." Lydia's objections were specific. Every bucket of water carried to a seedling was water not available for the garden, the cow, or the household. Every hour spent cultivating tree rows was an hour not spent on the 12 acres that might produce income. The shield would take years to grow tall enough to matter, and in the meantime, Beret would burn through her resources nursing a forest that provided nothing. And what if you are wrong about the drift? Lydia asked. What if those trees put the heaviest snow directly on your roof? I have seen windbreaks bury a house. I have seen them pile 6 feet against a door so it could not open. Beret could not answer the growth time problem. She could not promise the trees would survive. She could not guarantee that a design drawn from woven grass experiments and a childhood memory of sheep fences would scale to a force capable of protecting a building from a Nebraska blizzard. I know, Beret said. Then why? Because I cannot haul 5 cords by hand every winter for 4 years. I will die doing it. The trees are the only answer that gets stronger instead of weaker. Lydia stared at her for a long time. She did not agree. She did not convert. She walked back to her wagon and drove home, but she did not tell Beret to stop. The project became visible to the community the moment Beret began driving cedar stakes along 250 feet of angled line north of her cabin. She worked in late April, when the ground had thawed enough to accept posts, but the wind still carried a memory of winter. She used Edwin's post maul, swinging it from her right side to protect her healing ribs. Each strike drove the stake 3 inches into the clay. She needed 600 stakes to mark the full planting grid. She cut them from deadfall cottonwood in the river breaks, hauled them by sled, trimmed them to length with a hatchet, and drove them one by one into the frozen edge of the Nebraska spring. By the time she had completed the first arm of the chevron, a line of stakes marching north-northwest from a point 70 feet beyond the cabin, people had noticed. Word reached Sloane's store within a week. Outside the counter where Sloane posted overdue notes for public viewing, customers discussed the Weller claim with the easy cruelty of people who believe they are being practical. They called the planting the widow's funnel. Someone suggested Vangen's green grave. A freighter who had seen the stakes from the road asked whether Beret was building a fence that needed feeding. Sloane did not create the mockery. He cultivated it. He posted Beret's overdue note, $147, now accruing the interest he had promised to waive, near the counter where every customer could see it. He remarked to anyone who listened that the widow appeared able to buy trees, but not to repay honest debts. The distinction was calculated. Sloane did not need to call Beret foolish. He needed the community to see a woman choosing seedlings over solvency. The conclusion drew itself. The major confrontation came in May, when Sloane rode onto the Weller claim and found the western arm of the chevron approaching the disputed northern boundary. Sloane dismounted and walked the stake line with his hands behind his back, counting rows, measuring distances with his eye. He stopped where the outermost stakes came within 30 feet of the property edge. These trees, Sloane said, when they grow, if they grow, their roots will cross my line. Roots do not respect surveys, Beret said. Neither does wind. You are improving land that may belong to me within the year, Mrs. Weller. Every tree you plant makes the place easier for me to sell. Beret continued driving a stake. The post maul rang against the frozen wood. She did not look up. Then you should hope they live, she said. Sloane's expression did not change. He was a man who had learned to do his threatening at conversational volume. I hope you live long enough to understand the difference, he said, between planting trees and planting money in someone else's ground. He offered $120 for the claim. Cash. Enough to clear most of the debt, but not enough to start over anywhere that mattered. Beret would walk away with perhaps $20 and no land, no home, no future, except labor in someone else's house. No, Beret said. Sloane remounted. The offer decreases with each season, Mrs. Weller. By the time those trees reach your waist, I will not need to buy the claim. I will own it. He rode back toward Broken Bow. The stakes stood in their crooked lines behind him, marking a design that only Beret could see. Sheriff Kern returned 2 weeks later. He had heard about the planting from Sloan, and he rode out to see whether grief had finally broken the widow's judgment. He walked the stake rows. He counted the spacing. He looked at the angle of the arms and the position of the cabin behind them. Trees that close will bury the house before they save it, Kern said. It was the second time an experienced man had told Beret that her design would produce the opposite of protection. She did not explain the porosity principle, the layered density, the difference between a solid wall and a breathing barrier. She did not describe her mother's sheep fence or the experiments with stove ash and carpenter's rule. She returned to her line, reset a stake that Kern's horse had dislodged, and continued measuring. Kern watched for another minute. Then he rode away, shaking his head. Beret was now publicly committed to a plan that the sheriff called dangerous, the merchant called delusional, and the nearest sympathetic neighbor called a waste of water. She had spent $9.80 on nursery seedlings that had not yet arrived. She had driven 600 stakes into ground that might belong to Sloan by Christmas. She had no allies, no teacher, and no evidence beyond woven grass and childhood memory that any of this would work. The seedlings arrived in early May, packed in damp straw, 60 spruce, 80 cedar, 40 wild plum starts. She unpacked them on the cabin floor and found that 11 spruce had dried in transit. Their roots crumbled when she touched them. 49 living spruce, 80 cedar, 40 plum, plus the cottonwood cuttings she had harvested from the river, 112 green branches cut to 18-inch lengths and stored in wet sand. 281 plants against 250 feet of angled line, a 4-year deadline, and a wind that had already killed trees planted by people who knew far more about farming than she did. She began digging holes at dawn the next morning. She dug them 12 inches deep and 18 inches wide. She fanned the roots of each seedling the way she had seen her mother prepare transplants, spread outward and down, never curled, never cramped. She pressed the soil firm around each stem and shaped a shallow basin to hold water. By the third day, her hands were raw, and her left ribs ached from the twisting motion of the shovel. She had planted 47 seedlings. 234 remained. The spring rains had not yet come. Each plant needed water she carried from the well in 2 buckets balanced on a yoke across her shoulders, 200 yards each way. She had no one to help. She had no one to tell her whether the spacing was right, whether the depth was correct, whether the roots would take in this soil or curl and die the way 11 had already died in their shipping straw. She had a plan drawn in dirt. She had a childhood memory. She had 234 living plants and a well that had not gone dry yet. And somewhere in the distance, in a direction she had not yet looked, a man named Ansel Morey was watching a pile of discarded seedlings at the Arbor Day gathering and noticing that someone had sorted the dead ones by cause. Tell us in the comments, have you ever kept building something after the practical people in your life told you it could not work? The first cottonwoods went into the outermost row on the western arm. Beret cut the base of each 18-inch stick at an angle, pressed it into a muddy hole, and tamped the soil with her boot heel. Cottonwood cuttings were nearly free and nearly indestructible. If they found water, they would root within weeks and grow 4 to 6 feet in a single season. They would lose their leaves every autumn and stand as bare trunks through winter. But bare trunks still broke wind. They still added height and depth to the barrier, and in summer their shade would reduce evaporation from the evergreen rows inside. The cedar went into the middle band. Each seedling stood 8 inches tall and looked like something a child might pull up by accident. Beret spaced them 8 feet apart and staggered them so that no 2 cedars stood directly behind each other in adjacent rows. This was not a technique she had learned from anyone. It was an instinct from the woven grass experiments. If the barrier had straight channels running through it, the wind would find them. The spruce went into the interior band closest to the cabin side. They were the most expensive, the most fragile, and the slowest growing. Black Hills spruce could survive Nebraska winters, but it demanded moisture, shelter from drying wind, and years of patience. Each seedling was no taller than her hand. She watered them first, watered them most, and checked them every morning for signs of stress. The plum suckers went into the windward edge, the outermost row on each arm, in front of everything else. They were hardy, fast spreading, and dense at ground level. Their job was to close the bottom of the barrier where the wind hit first, catching drifting snow and tumbling debris before it reached the evergreen trunks. She worked from dawn until she could no longer see the stakes. She ate standing up. She carried water until her shoulders burned and then carried more. The yoke left bruises on her collarbones that darkened and hardened into permanent marks over the following weeks. By the end of May, 182 plants stood in the ground across the first arm and the beginning of the second arm. The stake lines extended ahead of the planting like a skeleton waiting for muscle. The work was perhaps one-third complete, and the growing season would not wait. On the first day of June, a hot south wind blew for 3 days straight. The soil cracked. 7 spruce seedlings turned brown at the tips. Beret carried water until the well dropped low enough to pull sand with each bucket. 47 plants died during the summer drought. 47 holes to redig. 47 losses to replace from stock she did not have. By autumn, 135 plants survived on the western arm. The eastern arm remained mostly stakes. The cottonwoods had rooted and thrown up thin green shoots. The cedars looked unchanged. The spruce looked smaller than when she had planted them. The wind returned in October. It tested the gaps between the seedlings and found nothing worth slowing down for. The tiny plants bent flat. The stakes rattled. The cabin walls leaked as badly as they had the year before. Beret had spent $9.80, 5 months of labor, and most of her water hauling capacity. She had a partial row of plants that a determined cow could destroy in an afternoon. The second winter was coming, and she still needed 5 cords of firewood she did not have. She began hauling deadfall again. The mare's hawk had improved enough to pull a light sled. Beret loaded it with half what Edwin's team could have carried and walked beside it for the 4-hour round trip to the river breaks. She made the trip 3 times a week through November, each time returning with less wood than the week consumed. The trees she had planted stood in their rows like promises nobody had asked her to keep. They were 6 inches tall. The wind did not notice them, the cold did not care, and Beret did not yet know that the man who would teach her how to keep them alive was spending the same autumn pruning damaged apple trees in a dying orchard 60 miles east, wondering whether his lungs would give out before his hands forgot what they knew. The second winter taught Beret the same lesson as the first, only louder. She burned through her hauled wood by mid-January. She tore apart the remaining fence rails on the south line. She fed the stove with twisted grass bundles that burned hot for 8 minutes and left ash that clogged the grate. The cabin temperature on the coldest nights hovered at 31 degrees, 1 degree below freezing, with the stove running continuously. She lost 4 hens to cold. The cows survived, but produced almost nothing. Beret ate boiled oats twice a day and began to understand that survival through attrition had a floor, and she was standing on it. By March of 1881, 135 seedlings stood in partial rows north of the cabin, none taller than a man's forearm, none visibly different from the scrub brush that dotted every unclaimed draw in the county. The chevron existed as stakes and intention. The living portion of it would not slow a child's breath. Spring arrived late and wet. The plum suckers greened first. The cottonwood cuttings threw up shoots that swayed in every breeze like grass. The cedars put out a quarter-inch of pale, new growth at their tips. 3 spruce showed no growth at all. Beret pulled them and found the roots curled upward in the holes she had dug, bent back on themselves like fists. She had planted them wrong. She did not know how to plant them right. The Arbor Day gathering in Broken Bow fell on the second Thursday of April, 1881. Nebraska had not yet made it a state holiday, but towns across the Central Plains held planting ceremonies, distributed seedlings, and listened to speeches about the civilizing power of trees on open ground. Beret did not attend for the speeches. She came for the seedlings. The nursery stock arrived in crates from a supplier in Lincoln, 9 spruce, cedar, elm, ash, and cottonwood bundled in damp burlap. By the time the speeches ended and the distribution began, the crates had sat in the sun for 2 hours. Half the spruce had dried. The burlap had gone stiff. Roots protruded from torn wrapping like broken fingers. People took what they wanted and left the rest. The rejects accumulated in a pile beside the loading dock. Stock too damaged, too small, or too dried to interest anyone planting a decorative yard tree. Beret crouched beside the reject pile and began sorting. She separated the dead into 3 groups: dried roots, stock that had lost moisture during shipping and would not recover, broken stems, stock that had been crushed under heavier bundles, frost-damaged tips, stock that had frozen during a late cold snap and might survive if the roots were sound. She was not aware that anyone was watching. Ansel Maury stood 12 feet away, leaning against a fence post, with his arms folded and his mouth closed. He was 61 years old, thin through the chest in a way that suggested his lungs had been working harder than the rest of him for some time. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 50 years handling plants, soil permanently lodged in the creases, nails cut short and flat, calluses on the pads of every finger. He had worked nurseries along the Great Lakes, repaired wagons for the Union Army, and spent the last 11 years tending fruit orchards in Otoe County, where the climate was kinder and the soil deeper than anything Custer County could offer. He had come to the Arbor Day gathering because a friend in Broken Bow had written to say the town could use someone who knew trees. Ansel had come to look, not to commit. His lungs were not improving. He had no interest in starting over. But he watched Beret sort the dead seedlings, and he did not walk away. She finished the 3 groups and began examining the frost-damaged pile. She bent each stem gently. She scraped bark with her thumbnail to check for green underneath. She pressed roots between her fingers to test whether they held moisture or crumbled. Ansel stepped closer. "Why 3 piles?" he asked. Beret looked up. She saw a thin man with clean hands and patient eyes. "Because each one died differently," she said. Ansel said nothing for a moment. He looked at the 3 groups, dried, broken, frozen. Then he reached into the frost-damaged pile, selected a spruce seedling, and sliced through the root ball with a folding knife. "This one," he said, holding the cut root up so Beret could see the cross-section. "The root is brown all the way through, dead before the frost. It was planted with the roots turned upward, probably pressed into a hole too narrow to spread them. The frost finished what the planting started." He said it the way a man describes weather, without judgment, without instruction, simply identifying what had happened and why. "I have 3 like that in my rows," Beret said. "I pulled them this week. The roots were curled." Ansel looked at her, not at the sorted piles, at her. "You have rows," he said. "I have the beginning of rows. Show me." Ansel Maury rode to the Weller claim 3 days later. He brought nothing except his folding knife, a survey chain he had carried since the army, and a brass compass that fit in his vest pocket. He did not offer to plant for her. He did not offer advice. He walked the stake lines in silence, counting paces, pausing to face into the wind and close his eyes. He crouched beside the surviving seedlings and pressed his thumb into the soil at their bases. He pulled one cedar from the ground, examined its roots, and replanted it without comment. Then he stood at the apex of the chevron and looked south toward the cabin. "Show me the design," he said. Beret drew it in the dirt with a stick, 2 arms, the angle, the cabin in the pocket behind the apex, shrubs in front, evergreens in the middle, cottonwood behind. Ansel asked questions. "Which direction is your worst wind?" "North-northwest." "How do you know?" "I watched ash. I watched snow ridges. I watched which side of the cabin freezes first." "How far is the nearest evergreen row from the cabin?" 70 feet. "Why 70? "Because the drift behind a solid wall was heaviest at 5 to 10 feet. I wanted the heaviest snow to fall before it reached the house." Ansel nodded slowly. He took the compass from his vest and sighted along the western arm. "Your point faces too far east," he said, "by 15 degrees, maybe 17. Your worst wind comes from 10 degrees west of true north. This arm meets it at the wrong angle. The wind will slide along it instead of passing through it." Beret did not argue. She had no instrument to verify the claim. She had used snow ridges and ash. He had a compass and 50 years of watching trees respond to moving air. "I will shift the stakes," she said. "Shift the apex. Leave the arms where they are and move the point 17 degrees west. It will widen your angle. That is better. A narrow funnel accelerates wind. A wide angle spreads it." This was the first lesson. It cost Beret 2 days of redriving stakes, but when she released ash from the new apex during the next north wind, the plume divided cleanly along both arms instead of curling past the western edge. The second lesson happened the following week. Ansel returned with 4 spruce seedlings he had purchased in town. He dug the first hole slowly, making Beret watch every motion. He cut the bottom of the hole flat. He spread the roots in a fan, each one pointing outward and slightly downward, none crossing another. He set the root collar exactly level with the surrounding soil, not above, not below. Then he pressed a shallow basin around the stem, wide enough to hold a cup of water without spilling. "The root goes where you tell it," Ansel said. "If you press it into a narrow hole, it curls. A curled root cannot find water. It turns back on itself and dies. The tree may survive 1 season on the moisture you carry to it, but the moment you stop watering, a curled root has nowhere to go." He sliced through one of Beret's failed transplants and showed her the brown spiral inside. Then he sliced through a healthy root from his seedling and showed her the white spread radiating outward. "Fan the roots, flat bottom, collar at grade, basin to hold rain." Beret knelt beside the next hole and prepared it exactly as he had demonstrated. Ansel watched without correcting her. When she finished, he pressed his thumbnail into the soil at the stem's base and checked the depth. "Good," he said. It was the only praise he offered that day. The physical cost of the method was immediate. Beret had been digging narrow holes with a post hole bar. Fast, efficient, and wrong. Ansel's method required a wide, flat-bottomed hole for every single plant. The digging took twice as long. But every seedling installed this way would have a chance of finding its own water within 2 seasons, which meant the difference between a tree that survived and a tree that waited to die. Beret carried water in paired buckets balanced on the yoke to prevent twisting her ribs. Ansel watched her carry and said nothing about the pace. He understood that the injury limited the load. He did not offer to carry for her. He understood that she needed to do the work herself, not because pride demanded it, but because she would be doing it alone for years after he left. They cultivated a 3-foot strip of bare soil around each planted row. The grass competed ferociously for moisture. A single season of unmowed grass beside a young evergreen could steal enough water to kill it. Ansel showed Beret how to hoe shallow, deep enough to cut roots, shallow enough to avoid disturbing the tree's new growth. The tree is a tenant, Ansel said. The grass was here first and will fight to stay. You're the landlord. You decide who gets the water. The third lesson was the one that changed the design from an experiment into a system. In June of 1881, Ansel brought a temporary brush panel to the claim, 6 feet long, 4 feet tall, woven from cottonwood branches. He stood it upright in the wind and had Beret walk behind it. "Feel that," he said. The air behind the solid panel was turbulent. It swirled. Beret's coat flapped in 2 directions. Loose straw on the ground lifted, spun, and landed in unpredictable heaps. Then Ansel removed alternate branches from the panel. He pulled every other horizontal stick, leaving gaps that Beret could see daylight through. "Now feel it," he said. The air behind the panel slowed. It moved, but evenly. Beret's coat hung still. The straw stayed down. A solid wall throws the wind over the top and pulls it back down behind. You get violence at close range and nothing at distance. A porous barrier bleeds the wind through and spends its force across depth. You lose nothing close and protect far. He drew in the dirt with his knife. Your shrubs close the bottom. They catch the low wind, the drifting snow, the ground-level blast that finds door cracks. Your evergreens hold winter density when everything else is bare. They are the wall that still has gaps, 50 to 60% solid, not 100. Your cottonwoods add height. Even leafless, a trunk and branches 20 feet tall disturb the air column and spread the protection further. He looked at Beret. This is not one fence. It is 3 fences, each doing different work. The wind must get through all 3. By the time it reaches your cabin, it has lost most of what makes it dangerous. Beret understood. She also understood that the 3-layer design required more plants, more water, more years and more labor than the single-row approach she had originally planned. "How many plants?" she asked. "If you do both arms fully, with replacements for what will die, boughs because a third of them will die, you need between 300 and 350 living plants at maturity." Beret said nothing for a long time. "I have 135, she said. "Then you need 2 more springs and whatever money you can spare." The years moved in a rhythm of planting and loss. Spring of 1881, 182 plants installed across both arms. 47 died during the summer drought. Ansel taught Beret to check soil moisture by pushing a sharpened stick into the ground. If it came up dry below 4 inches, the tree needed water that day. If it came up damp, the tree could wait. This single technique saved her an estimated 40 bucket trips per week. Spring of 1882. Beret replanted 64 gaps and extended the western arm to its full length. In July, a neighbor's steer broke through the fence and trampled the inner cedar row, destroying 19 seedlings. Beret found the steer standing in her planting rows, chewing plum shoots. She drove it out, repaired the fence with wire she could not afford, and replanted the damaged section from her own cuttings. Ansel came twice that month. He said nothing about the steer. He helped her straighten the bent cedars and showed her how to brace a young tree with a notched stake and a strip of cloth, tight enough to support, loose enough to allow the trunk to flex and build strength. 1883, 312 living plants. The first cedars reached waist height, roughly 3 feet. The cottonwoods had grown to 8 or 9 feet and threw visible shadows in summer. The plum suckers had spread along the windward edge in a thick, tangled mat that caught tumbling debris and drifting straw. But the spruces remained heartbreakingly small, 2 feet, perhaps 2.5. Black Hill's spruce grew at its own pace and would not be hurried. Sloane shifted tactics. He stopped offering to buy the claim and began charging Beret cash for everything she purchased: nails, wire, kerosene, flour. He refused credit. Every other homesteader in the county bought on account. Beret paid from a shrinking reserve that dropped below $20. 1884. Grasshoppers arrived in August and stripped every deciduous leaf within 2 miles. The cottonwood canopy vanished in 3 days. The plum suckers were chewed to bare stems. But the cedars with their resinous needles survived. The grasshoppers did not prefer them. Beret had lost her wind-facing shrub layer and most of her height layer in a single week. She would not recover the growth until the following spring. She also lost 14 pounds that year. The hauling, hoeing, and water carrying had consumed more than her food supply replaced. Her dresses hung loose. Her hands had become permanently rough, the knuckles swollen from gripping tools in cold weather. Ansel noticed and said nothing, because he understood that telling a working person to rest was the same as telling them to quit. 1885. Arbor Day became an official Nebraska state holiday. The governor signed the proclamation. Newspapers printed editorials about the importance of tree planting on the open plains. None of them mentioned a widow north of Broken Bow who had been planting for 4 years in lines that her neighbors called a funnel and a green grave. 1886. The railroad reached Broken Bow. The first train arrived to a crowd that included Sloane, who understood immediately that rail access would double land values within 5 years. Every quarter section in the county became more valuable overnight, including the 160 acres that Beret Weller had been improving with 7 years of tree growth. Sloane had offered $120 3 years earlier. The claim was now worth 5 times that amount. His determination to acquire it increased in proportion. He approached Beret at the general store, not Sloane's own store, but a competitor where she bought flour to avoid his credit embargo. "The railroad changes things," Sloane said. "Land that was worth $2 an acre is worth 10. You're sitting on $1,600 of property with $200 of debt. That is not a position of strength, Mrs. Weller. That is a position of leverage for whoever holds the note." "The note is for $147, Beret said, "with interest." "I have not agreed to interest." "The note does not require your agreement, Mrs. Weller. It requires payment." He was right. The original terms had been set between Sloane and Edwin. Beret had inherited the debt, not the negotiation. 1887, the 7th growing season. The cottonwood stood 18 to 22 feet tall, bare in winter, but massive enough that their trunks and interlocking branches disturbed the wind even without leaves. The red cedars had reached 10 to 14 feet. The tallest a man could not see over from the ground. The spruces, finally, had reached 6 to 9 feet, their dense blue-green branches overlapping at ground level between the trunks. The shrub layer had recovered from the grasshoppers and filled in thick enough to stop a dog from pushing through. For the first time, Beret could stand behind the western arm during a north wind and feel the difference on her face. The air still moved. It was not calm, but it moved slowly, evenly, without the sharp, cutting edge that stripped warmth from skin and forced snow through every crack in a wall. She opened her winter ledger and calculated fuel use. The previous winter, 1886 to 87, she had burned 5 1/2 cords. Her first exposed winters had consumed nearly 8. The difference was not entirely the trees. She had also sealed the cabin joints with a mixture of clay, lime, and cattle hair that Ansel had taught her. She had added a second layer of sod banking and reoriented the stovepipe to draw more effectively. But even accounting for the cabin improvements, the windbreak was doing measurable work. The north wall no longer froze from the inside. The stove flame drew straight. The cup of water that had iced over on the bench during the first winter now sat liquid through the night. 7 years. 325 living plants. 2 arms extending 100 feet beyond the cabin on each side. A porous barrier 50 to 60% solid that slowed the ground level wind without throwing it skyward. The trees had reached the minimum height and density that Ansel had projected during the first summer of teaching. The design was complete. It had not been tested. In December of 1887, Ansel and Beret conducted their final pre-winter inspection. The method was simple. Ansel tied identical strips of white cloth to 2 stakes, one driven into the open prairie 100 yards north of the windbreak, one driven into the ground beside the cabin's south wall. Both strips hung from the same height. Both faced north. During a 20-mile-per-hour wind, a common late autumn blow, nothing unusual, the outer strip snapped horizontal and stayed rigid. The cloth beside the cabin lifted, fluttered, and fell. It could not sustain extension. The wind that reached it had lost too much force. Ansel brought a handful of loose straw and dropped it in the open field. It scattered instantly, driven south in a ragged line. He walked behind the windbreak and released the same amount of straw beside the cabin. It fell at his feet and stayed. They checked the stove. During the same wind, Beret opened the cabin door to the north. The flame in the firebox tilted slightly but did not gutter. In the first winter, opening the north-facing door during any wind had pulled the flames sideways hard enough to draw smoke into the room. The north wall thermometer read 8 degrees warmer than it had during a similar wind in 1881, before the trees had reached functional height. Ansel recorded the data in his careful script. Temperature differential. Wind reduction estimated by cloth behavior. Fuel consumption projected at 5 1/4 cords for the current winter, compared to approximately 8 during the first exposed years. A reduction of roughly 32%. The numbers satisfied Ansel. They did not satisfy Kern. The sheriff visited the claim after hearing Ansel's report through second-hand channels at the store. He walked behind the windbreak, tested the wind himself, and acknowledged the reduction. But he pointed to the heavy snowdrift building north of the outer shrub row, a white ridge 4 feet deep extending the length of the western arm. "That drift is your enemy," Kern said. "An ordinary wind put that there. What does a blizzard put? 8 feet? 10? It will reach the cabin." Ansel agreed with the concern. A heavy storm would increase the drift substantially. That was the barrier's purpose, Mike's, to catch snow before it reached the house. But if the drift grew large enough, it could extend past the design's catch zone and pile against the cabin walls. They walked the space between the outer shrub row and the cabin, 70 feet. The drift's leading edge stood at 35 feet from the shrubs, halfway. A storm 3 times as powerful might push it to 50 feet. That still left 20 feet of clearance. "Might," Kern said. "You are betting her life on might." "I'm betting her life on measurement," Ansel said, "which is more than anyone else has offered." Kern left unconverted. He had seen the evidence. He did not trust it. The 20-mile-per-hour wind was not a blizzard, and a cloth strip was not a thermometer inside a cabin filled with a dying woman. Ansel then did something that surprised Beret. He walked the full perimeter one more time, slowly, and marked 2 emergency passages through each arm, gaps wide enough for a person to pass through but angled so that wind could not blow straight down them. He tied ropes between posts at each passage. "If you need to leave the cabin during a storm," he said, "you follow the western arm south. If you need to reach the barn, You follow the rope to the eastern passage. Do not cross the open ground between the arms. In a full whiteout, you will lose direction in 10 steps. Beret asked why he was preparing escape routes for a structure he had just declared sound. Ansel looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something between pride and apology. Because the design is sound, he said, and the prairie does not care. He coughed. He had been coughing since October, a dry hack that came in clusters and left him winded. Beret had noticed. She had said nothing. Ansel had said nothing. The cough existed between them like a fourth skeptic, one that could not be argued with or converted. "One more thing," Ansel said. "After the first hard freeze, inspect every low gap. The shrubs contract. The ground freezes and shifts the roots. A gap at ground level can channel wind like a bellows. Walk the line. Close what opens." He left for town that afternoon. He did not say goodbye because he expected to return in a week. On January 12th, 1888, he had not returned. His cough had worsened into a chest congestion that kept him in the boarding house, propped on pillows, unable to walk more than 50 yards without stopping to breathe. And the morning arrived warm. Beret noticed the warmth before she noticed anything else. She opened the cabin door to a temperature that felt wrong for January. Perhaps 35 degrees, with a softness in the air that belonged to late March. Ice dripped from the roof edge. The snow in the yard had a wet sheen. The cow stood in the barn doorway instead of pressing against the interior wall. It was the kind of morning that made settlers open windows, send children to school without heavy coats, and plan outdoor work they had postponed for weeks. In town, Broken Bow's streets filled with people who had been confined since Christmas. School opened on schedule. The mail wagon departed south. Beret did not trust the warmth. She had lived through 7 Nebraska winters. A January thaw this pronounced, this sudden, meant the atmosphere was unsettled. Warm air did not arrive in January without cold air coming to claim the space it had abandoned. She hauled 7 armloads of wood into the cabin and stacked them beside the stove. She filled both water buckets from the well. She brought the cow into the barn and secured the door. She checked the ropes on the emergency passages. She had not completed the low gap inspection Ansel had requested. The thaw had softened the ground, and she had spent the previous days patching the barn roof. She walked the western arm quickly, looking for obvious openings. Most of the shrub layer held firm, but the junction between the 2 arms, the apex of the chevron, where the northern point met the overlapping zone, had a gap at ground level where 2 plum bushes had died over the summer and not been replaced. She noted it. She did not fix it. There was not time to weave brush into the opening before whatever was coming arrived. By 11 o'clock, the northern sky had changed color. The blue withdrew. A gray-green wall appeared on the horizon, moving south at a speed Beret could track by watching it consume landmarks. First, the far hills vanished. Then the tree line along the creek 4 miles north. Then the neighbor's barn. Then the open ground between the neighbor's barn and the windbreak's outer edge. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes. The wet snow in the yard turned to crust. The dripping from the roof stopped. The air pressure changed in a way Beret felt in her ears, a tightness as if the sky had compressed. At 12:30, the wind arrived. It did not build gradually. It struck. One moment the air was still and cold. The next, the world disappeared. Driven snow. Not falling snow, but old snow ripped from the ground and thrown horizontal, erased every visible reference point. The barn vanished. The woodpile vanished. The outer tree line became a sound, not a sight. A roaring hiss of wind through branches that Beret could hear but could not see from the cabin window. The temperature continued falling. Within an hour, it passed 0. Within 3 hours, it would reach 20 below. By nightfall, 36 degrees below 0. Beret closed the cabin shutters, sealed the door with a rolled blanket at the threshold, and fed the stove. The iron box drew cleanly. The flame pointed straight up. Through the north wall, she could hear the windbreak working, a deep, continuous sound like water moving through a channel, the wind dividing and slowing as it passed through 300 feet of layered wood and branch. The north wall thermometer read 49 degrees, cold but not freezing, not the 31 degrees of her first exposed winters. The trees were doing their work. Then someone pounded on the door. Once. Then nothing. Beret unrolled the threshold blanket and pulled the door inward against the wind. A boy fell across the threshold onto her floor. He was 12 years old. His mittens were frozen to his coat sleeves. His face was white except where the driven snow had scraped the skin raw across his cheekbones. 2 fingers on his left hand had turned the color of candle wax. It was Owen Oakes, Lydia's son. He had been walking home from school when the storm hit. The road vanished in the first minutes. He had wandered blind until he found the western arm of the tree line, a physical edge he could feel with his outstretched hand, and followed it south until he reached the cabin. He could not speak. His jaw was clenched shut from cold. Beret dragged him to the stove, stripped his frozen coat, and wrapped him in every dry blanket she owned. She did not press his hands against the heat. She held them between her own palms and let the warmth return slowly. Ansel had told her once that warming frozen tissue too fast could destroy it more completely than the cold. The boy's fingers changed from wax white to gray, then, slowly, to a dark, painful red. He screamed when the feeling returned. Beret held his hand steady and let him scream. Owen being inside the cabin created 3 immediate problems. First, 2 people consumed oxygen and heat faster than one. The stove would burn through its supply sooner. Second, Beret's attention was split between maintaining the fire and monitoring the child for signs of deeper cold injury. Third, Lydia Oakes was somewhere outside, searching for her son in a storm that killed exposed people in less than an hour. Beret could not leave the cabin to find Lydia without abandoning Owen. She could not send word. She could not signal. The windbreak protected the cabin and the ground immediately around it. Beyond the tree line, the prairie was a killing field of moving ice and 0 visibility. She fed the stove. She checked Owen's breathing. She watched the north wall. At 2 o'clock, the eastern arm failed. The sound changed first. The low, even pressure hum that the windbreak produced, the sound of slowed air passing through porous branches, developed a higher pitch on the eastern side. A whistle, thin and sharp, cutting through the deeper roar. Beret crossed to the east-facing window and pressed her ear against the shutters. She could hear it clearly, a focused jet of air pushing through a narrow gap with enough force to produce a tone. The root plate of a cedar on the eastern arm had torn loose in the sustained wind. The tree had not snapped. It had tilted, its root ball lifting partially from the frozen ground, creating a gap between its trunk and the neighboring trees. Wind had found the opening and was accelerating through it. The same bellows effect Ansel had warned her about. The gap was aimed at the barn. If the barn wall took a direct blast from channeled 50-mile-per-hour wind, the boards Edwin had raised would not hold. The cow was inside. The remaining quarter cord of emergency firewood was inside. If the barn went, Beret would lose her animal and her fuel reserve in the same hour. She could not reset a tree in a blizzard. The cedar weighed hundreds of pounds, and its root plate was frozen into the soil. But she could reduce the gap. Beret pulled on Edwin's coat, wrapped a wool scarf across her face, and tied a rope from the cabin door handle to her waist. She took a woven willow hurdle that had been leaning against the barn wall, one of Ansel's density test panels, never discarded, and fought her way through the passage in the eastern arm. The wind outside the windbreak's protection was not survivable for extended exposure. It struck her chest hard enough to stop her forward motion. Snow drove into the scarf and melted against her skin, then froze again in the next breath. She could not see the barn. She could not see the damaged cedar. She followed the rope and the sound. The gap was 4 feet wide. The tilted cedar leaned at 15 degrees. Its root played a dark mound of frozen earth against the white ground. Wind screamed through the opening with enough force to throw snow horizontally at waist height. Beret did not try to close the gap completely. Ansel's lesson about the brush panel held in her mind, even through the cold and the noise. A solid patch would create turbulence. A porous patch would slow the jet. She angled the willow hurdle across the opening, not squared to the wind, but at 30 degrees, deflecting the blast rather than stopping it. She lashed the top of the hurdle to the neighboring cedar's trunk with fence wire, twisting it with hands she could barely feel. She packed loose spruce boughs at ground level, stuffing them into the space between the hurdle's base and the frozen soil. She left gaps, deliberately. Every instinct screamed to fill every opening, but the lesson held. Porosity, not blockage. The whistle dropped in pitch. It did not stop, but the focused jet diffused into a broader, weaker flow that spread across a wider area instead of concentrating on the barn wall. Beret had been outside for nearly 12 minutes. Ice had formed on her eyelashes thick enough to blur her vision. The skin on her left cheek had lost sensation. Her fingers inside the gloves had passed through pain into a heavy numbness that frightened her more than the wind. She followed the rope back through the passage, fell through the cabin door, and pushed it shut with her shoulder. Owen stared at her from the blankets. His eyes were wide. She could not speak for 30 seconds. The thermometer on the north wall read 42 degrees. It had dropped 7 degrees during the 12 minutes the door was open, but it had not dropped below freezing. The stove was still drawing. The flame was still vertical. Beret fed the stove 3 logs and sat on the floor with her back against the door, holding her frozen hands in her armpits and waiting for the pain. In town, Ansel Morey was propped against his boarding house pillows at 3 o'clock when a neighbor told him that Owen Oakes had not returned from school. Lydia was searching. The road was impassable. 3 men had already turned back after losing visibility within 200 yards of Broken Bow's limits. Ansel told the neighbor to find Sheriff Kern. When Kern arrived, Ansel was standing at the boarding house window, coughing so hard the glass fogged between spasms. He should not have been standing. He should not have been talking. But he drew the windbreak from memory on the window pane with his finger. "The boy knows the trees," Ansel said. "He helped his mother hoe the shrub rows 2 summers ago. If he found the western arm, he will follow it south. He will reach the cabin." Kern asked how Ansel could know the boy had found the trees. "Because there is nothing else to find between the school road and the Weller claim," Ansel said. "Open ground does not guide anyone. The trees are the only line." Kern was not convinced, but he had no better option. Every route south was invisible. The only reference point between town and the Weller claim was the windbreak, a physical structure a man could touch with his hand and follow through a whiteout. Ansel told Kern how to approach. "Do not ride at the point. Come along the west arm from the south. If she kept the lower row closed, you will feel the edge before you see the house. Stay inside the tree line. If you cross the open gap between the arms, you will lose direction." Kern tied a rope from his saddle horn to his waist. He wrapped his face. He rode south into a wind that made his horse pin its ears flat and try to turn. He made it 3/4 of a mile before the horse planted its front hooves and refused to move. The wind was too strong. The snow was too thick. Kern could not see 10 feet in any direction. His compass was useless because he could not hold it steady. Time had lost meaning. He did not know whether he had been riding 15 minutes or 45. He dismounted. He tied the horse to a fence post he found by stumbling into it. He continued on foot, one arm extended, the rope trailing behind him. He walked blind into the wind for what felt like an hour. The cold had moved past discomfort into something structural. It was not on his skin, it was in his bones, in his lungs, in the muscles of his legs that were starting to stiffen. He understood, in a professional way, that he was approaching the limits of what his body could sustain. He had recovered frozen people who had felt exactly what he was feeling now and had decided to lie down. Then the wind changed. It did not stop. The roar above his head continued. But at ground level, where the force mattered most, where it stole heat, drove snow into clothing, pushed a man sideways, blinded him, froze the moisture in his lungs, the pressure dropped. The wall of moving air became a current. His coat stopped straining against his body. He straightened. He opened his eyes. He was standing inside the western arm of the windbreak. The trees were invisible in the snow, but he could feel them, branches brushing his right shoulder, trunks appearing as dark vertical shapes at arm's length. The wind still moved through the barrier, but it moved with a fraction of its open ground force. The snow that reached him drifted rather than drove. He could breathe without turning his head. He followed the tree line south, branch by branch, trunk by trunk. The ropes Beret and Ansel had strung between the emergency passages guided his hands when the visibility closed to nothing. He reached the cabin. Yellow lamplight showed in the gap between the shutters. Smoke came from the chimney, not streaming sideways as it would from an exposed building, but rising nearly straight before the wind above the tree line caught it and tore it apart. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because Kern still does not know whether he has reached a refuge or the last place the child was alive. Kern pounded on the door. Beret opened it. Her gloves were sliced from fence wire, and her cheek was white with frostbite. Behind her, Owen Oakes lay under blankets, awake, his damaged fingers wrapped in cloth. The thermometer on the table near the stove read 75 degrees. Kern stepped inside. He stood in the warmth and the lamplight and the impossible fact of this small room. The far north wall read 66 degrees, colder but not freezing. The stove burned steadily but not desperately. The iron was dark, not glowing red. A pot of coffee on the shelf was still liquid. The air smelled of wood smoke and wool and the human warmth of two living people in a space that every experienced voice in the county had told him would be a coffin. He had expected a frozen widow. He had expected a door frozen shut, a stove gone cold, a body beside it. Instead, he stood in a 75-degree room while 56-mile-per-hour wind passed over a shield made of living wood, slowed to a fraction of its force, and arrived at the cabin walls with barely enough power to move the curtain. "Lydia is out there," Beret said. "She went south on the road, looking for Owen." Kern looked at the door. He had just walked through the worst weather he had experienced in 20 years of plains freighting. The idea of going back outside was not something his body wanted to accept. "I know the passages," Beret said. "I built them. You do not." She wrapped her scarf, retied the rope, and opened the door. Kern followed. They moved along the western arm in the direction Lydia would have traveled, south, then curving east along the road. The tree line served as both wind shelter and guide rail. Beret led, her hand on the trunks, counting trees because she knew the spacing and could track distance by count. Kern held the rope behind her and kept his head down. 300 yards south of the cabin, Beret found Lydia crawling beside a fence line. She was hypothermic. Her speech had slurred to single syllables. Her coat was soaked from the melting snow of the morning thaw, which had now frozen solid around her. She had lost her mittens. She had lost direction. She had been following the fence because it was the only thing she could feel with her hands. They pulled her upright. Beret took one arm, Kern took the other. They followed the rope back along the tree line, through the western passage, across the 20 feet of partially sheltered ground, and into the cabin. Lydia collapsed beside the stove. Owen saw his mother and made a sound that was not a word. She could not reach for him. Beret wrapped her hands and placed them in her lap and told Owen to sit beside her and share the blankets. Outside, the storm continued until after midnight. The temperature bottomed at 36 degrees below zero. The wind did not relent. Inside the cabin, the thermometer never dropped below 62 degrees. The stove burned less than 1/8 of a cord during the entire event. The chimney drew straight. The cow survived in the barn without frost injury. The north wall remained cold but not freezing. Ice did not form on the water bucket. The cabin's windows, sealed with oiled canvas, did not rattle. On the unprotected prairie surrounding the Weller claim, the storm destroyed what it found. Amos Pell, Sloane's tenant in the exposed shack 2 miles east, lost the north half of his roof to the wind. He survived only because he burrowed into a hay bank and let the snow bury him. 2 of his cattle froze standing. 6 hogs died in an unprotected pen. Across the wider region, the storm killed hundreds. Children who had been sent to school that warm morning died within sight of buildings they could not find. Teachers held students through the night in schoolhouses heated by whatever furniture they could burn. Ranchers froze between their houses and their barns. A distance of 50 feet, crossed 1,000 times without incident, become a death trap in a whiteout. The blizzard passed before dawn. The morning of January 13th was still and clear, and 22 degrees below zero. Beret opened the cabin door. The world beyond the windbreak was white and flat and scoured. Drifts had buried fence posts. The road was gone. The neighbor's barn stood half exposed, its north wall stripped of boards. Inside the windbreak, the ground showed the design's final proof. The heaviest drift lay north of the outer shrub row, exactly where Beret had planned it, a white ridge 5 feet deep, extending the length of both arms. Between the shrub row and the cabin, the snow was shallow and even. It had not piled against the walls. It had not blocked the door. The trees had caught it, held it, and deposited it in the field beyond, where it would melt into the spring soil and do no harm. One cedar lay at a broken angle on the eastern arm, the tree whose root plate had torn loose during the storm. Beret's willow hurdle still lashed to its neighbor, still angled, still porous. The emergency repair had held. 324 living plants remained. One lost, the rest standing, ice-coated, bent slightly south by the weight of the wind they had absorbed, but standing. Kern stepped out behind Beret. He looked north across the white drift and the dark line of trees and the open prairie beyond, where nothing stood between the wind and whatever it chose to kill. He said nothing. He put his hat on and walked to find his horse. Lydia held Owen in the blankets and did not move for another hour. The thermometer beside the coffee still read 75 degrees. The storm left Custer County under a silence that felt borrowed. For 2 days after the blizzard, the air did not move. Smoke from every surviving chimney rose straight into a sky so pale it looked rinsed. The temperature climbed from 36 below to 4 above and held there, as if the atmosphere had exhausted itself and could not decide what to do next. Beret spent those 2 days inside the cabin with Owen, Lydia, and Kern. Owen's damaged fingers blistered, darkened, and began to recover sensation in all but the smallest, which remained numb and gray at the tip. Lydia slept 14 hours the first day and could not stop shaking the second. Kern sat in a chair beside the stove and said almost nothing. He ate what Beret offered. He watched the thermometer. He looked at the north wall the way a man looks at a door he expected to find locked and found open. On the morning of the third day, Kern put on his coat. He stood at the cabin door and looked north through the windbreak at the long white drift lying harmlessly in the field beyond the outer shrubs. "I need to file a report," he said, "for the county." "What will it say?" Beret asked. Kern paused. He touched the door frame with one hand, the same frame he had pressed his palm against 7 years earlier when he had felt the wind passing through the chinking. "It will say the Weller cabin sustained no structural damage during the event of January 12th. All occupants survived, livestock intact." He paused again. "And that the claimant's tree planting contributed materially to the outcome." It was not praise, it was an inventory, delivered in the same flat tone he had used to catalog the half barn and the 3 chords and the broadside roof in 1880. But the content had changed, the numbers had changed, and Kern was a man who trusted numbers. He rode south toward Broken Bow. Beret stood in the doorway and watched him go. Kern's conversion happened publicly, and it happened at Sloan's store, because that was where the county gathered to exchange news after a disaster. The store was full. Men who had spent 2 days digging out livestock, repairing roofs, and searching for missing neighbors stood along the counter and beside the stove, trading accounts. The blizzard had killed 3 people within 20 miles of Broken Bow. 2 were children caught between school and home. 1 was an elderly man found frozen beside his own barn door, 20 feet from safety. Kern entered, removed his hat, and waited until the conversation paused. "I rode to the Weller claim during the storm," he said. "I want to tell you what I found." He told them about the ride, the horse refusing, the walk through the open wind, the snow striking hard enough to sting through wool, the moment he could not face north for more than a few seconds. Then he told them about crossing the tree line. "The wind did not stop," Kern said. "I want to be clear about that. The trees do not stop the wind, but the force at ground level dropped enough that I could stand upright. I could open my eyes. I could breathe without turning my head. The difference between the open prairie and the space behind that western row was the difference between drowning and waiting." He told them about the cabin, the lamplight, the upright chimney, the door that opened from the inside. Owen oaks under blankets, the thermometer at 75 degrees. "I expected to find a frozen widow," Kern said. "I expected to find a door iced shut and a dead fire. Instead, I found a heated room with a working stove and 2 living people." Someone asked about the drift. Kern had predicted the trees would bury the house. Kern nodded. He did not flinch from it. "I told her those trees would bury the house before they saved it," he said. "I was wrong about the drift. The trees put it where she planned, in the field north of the shrubs. The heaviest snow was 50 feet from the cabin. The ground beside the walls had less snow than any exposed yard in the county." He paused. "I could not stand upright in the open. I could behind that western row." Then he repeated the old dismissal one more time, slowly, so that every person in the room could hear the correction embedded in it. "I told her those trees would bury the house before they saved it. They did neither. They buried the windward field and left the house standing." The room was quiet, not because the men were moved. They were practical people who processed information before they processed feeling, but because Kern was not a man who admitted error. He had recovered frozen bodies. He had told settlers to leave. He had been right often enough that being wrong publicly cost him something visible, and every person in the store understood the weight of what he was paying. Sloane stood behind his counter. He did not speak. The measurable comparison traveled faster than the story. Barrett opened her winter ledger to anyone who asked. The numbers were specific because she had recorded them every year since the first winter, in the same notebook, in the same hand. Early exposed winters, 1880 to 83, she had burned approximately 7 3/4 to 8 cords per season. The cabin temperature on severe nights had dropped below freezing despite continuous fire. The north wall had iced from the inside. The stove had drawn sideways during every north wind, consuming fuel faster and producing less usable heat. Winter of 1887 to 88 with the windbreak at maturity, projected fuel use was 5 1/4 cords, a reduction of roughly 32%. The cabin's storm minimum had been 62 degrees. The stove had drawn straight. Ice had not formed on the interior walls. By comparison, the Oaks cabin, 2 miles east, fully exposed, with heavier stove use, had recorded a storm minimum of 39 degrees. Lydia had burned more wood in the single storm event than Barrett had burned in the preceding 2 weeks. Amos Pell's shack had lost its roof. His stove had gone out when the chimney collapsed. He had survived only by abandoning the building entirely. Barrett was careful with the comparison. She told everyone who asked that the numbers reflected 2 changes, not 1. She had sealed the cabin joints. She had added sod banking. She had reoriented the stovepipe. The windbreak was not the only factor. It was the largest factor, the one that could not be replicated with rags, clay, and willpower. But she would not claim credit the trees had not earned. This honesty cost her nothing and gained her everything. The settlers who listened were practical people. They could detect exaggeration the way they could detect a lame horse. A woman who admitted the limits of her method was a woman whose claims about its strengths could be trusted. 11 families asked Barrett for planting layouts before spring. Barrett refused to sell them a plan. This confused people. They expected her to draw a V on paper, hand it over, and collect a fee. Several offered to pay. One man rode 12 miles with cash in his pocket, expecting to buy a diagram the way he would buy a seed catalog. Barrett told him to put the money away. "Your house does not face the same direction as mine," she said. "Your worst wind does not come from the same quarter. Your soil holds water differently. Your barn is on the wrong side. If I give you my design and you copy it, the drift will land on your roof instead of your field." She visited each property herself. She brought a length of red cloth, a handful of stakes, and Ansel's brass compass. At each site, she had the owner do the work. First, tie the cloth to a stake and watch it for 3 days during different winds. Record which direction it points most often and which direction produces the strongest pull. Second, walk the property after a snowfall and mark where the drifts form naturally. These are the places wind is already depositing its load. The barrier must redirect that deposit away from buildings and doors. Third, identify the building's most vulnerable wall, usually the one facing the dominant wind, and measure the distance between it and the proposed tree line. Too close, and the drift buries the wall. Too far, and the protection weakens. The distance depends on the expected tree height, which depends on the species, which depends on the soil and the water. Fourth, plan the barrier's ends. A line that stops too short leaves the wind a path around the edge, curling back with enough force to make the protected zone smaller than expected. The arms must extend well past the building, at least 50 feet beyond the farthest wall. Fifth, plant in layers. Shrubs on the windward face. evergreens in the middle, tall stock behind, 50 to 60% density. Not a wall. The process took half a day per property. Bray refused to plant the first tree on any claim until the owner had watched the cloth for a full week and could tell her from observation rather than assumption where the dangerous wind came from. The trees are the last step, she told every family. The wind is the first. She gave away cottonwood cuttings, cedar starts, and the measurements from her failed rows, the first-year losses, the curled root deaths, the spacing that had produced turbulence instead of shelter. She charged only for purchased spruce stock at cost. Lydia Oakes visited the Weller claim 10 days after the storm. She walked the full perimeter of the windbreak in silence, touching branches, looking at the drift line, measuring the distance between the outer shrubs and the cabin wall with her eyes. Then she stood beside the stove and spoke. "I counted every bucket you carried," Lydia said. "Every trip to the well, every hour you spent hoeing those rows when you could have been fixing fence or putting up hay. I counted every bucket and I told myself you were wasting water on a dream." She paused. "I never counted the winters the trees would keep working after you stopped." It was not an apology. It was something more useful. A practical woman revising a practical judgment based on evidence she could no longer deny. Lydia had spent 7 years watching Beret carry water and had concluded, reasonably, that the effort would not produce a return. She had been wrong about the return. She was not wrong about the effort. The buckets had been real. The cost had been real. The question was whether the cost had purchased something that lasted. The trees would work for 50 years after the last bucket was carried. Lydia understood compound returns. She had simply never applied the concept to wood and wind. Sloane's initial response was not conversion. It was calculation. He came to Beret's cabin 4 days after Kern's public account, not to congratulate, but to challenge. "The fuel comparison is dishonest," Sloane said, standing in her doorway without removing his hat. "You sealed the walls, you banked the foundation, you fixed the stovepipe. Any one of those improvements would reduce wood consumption. You are crediting the trees for work the mud did." He was partly right, and Beret said so. "The cabin improvements helped, maybe 10%, maybe 12%. The rest is the wind. You cannot separate them. I can, because I sealed the cabin in 1881 and still burned 8 cords that winter. The trees were too small to matter. The reduction came after the trees reached height, not before." Sloane had no answer for the chronology. He stood in the doorway and looked at the windbreak, the dark line of cedars and spruce, the bare cottonwood trunks standing like pillars, the thick mat of plum brush along the leading edge, and saw something he had not expected to see on the Weller claim. Value. Not sentimental value. Market value. A functional windbreak on 160 acres of railroad-adjacent land made the property worth more than bare ground. The trees Sloane had mocked as the widow's funnel were now an improvement that any buyer would pay a premium for. He offered 4 times his original price for the claim, $600, cash. Beret refused. Sloane left without argument. He was recalculating. The woman he had expected to dispossess through debt and attrition had built something on his doorstep that made her position stronger every year. The trees grew. The value grew. The debt stayed the same. He began quietly, asking Kern how wide Beret had made the fire break around the conifers. He asked the question as if it were idle curiosity. Kern told Beret that evening. "He is not curious," Kern said. "He is planning." "Let him plan," Beret said. "He will plant too dense and learn the same lesson twice." Ansel Morey arrived at the Weller claim in late February, thin and coughing, but upright. He had walked the last half mile from the road because his rented horse could not navigate the drifts. Beret saw him from the cabin window and met him at the western arm. They did not embrace. They were not the kind of people who expressed relief through contact. Ansel looked at the windbreak, the ice-coated branches, the bent cedars, the one gap where his willow hurdle still lashed to the surviving tree, and said, "Show me everything." They walked the full shield together, Ansel leaning on a walking stick Beret had not seen before, Beret pointing to each section and describing what had happened during the storm, the damaged cedar gap, the hurdle repair, the snow-loaded branches on the eastern arm that had bent but not broken, the eddy near the eastern end where wind curled around the arm's terminus and deposited a small, sharp drift against the emergency passage, a dangerous accumulation of dead needles beneath the oldest cedars, dry fuel waiting for a spark in the wrong season. Ansel did not direct her. He did not tell her what to fix. He asked what she intended to change. Beret described her plan: replace the damaged cedar with 2 smaller trees spaced to maintain porosity, extend the eastern arm another 30 feet to prevent the terminal eddy, clear the dead needles and prune the lowest branches to reduce fire risk, add a second rope guide through the western passage for anyone unfamiliar with the layout. Ansel listened to the entire plan without interruption. When she finished, he said, "The eastern extension should angle 5 degrees south. The wind wraps that corner from the northeast during spring storms. If you extend it due east, you create a channel." It was the last technical correction he would ever make on the Weller claim. Beret noted it and changed the angle. They sat on the bench beside the south wall of the cabin, the warm side where the windbreak and the sun collaborated to create a pocket that felt 10 degrees warmer than the air, and drank coffee without speaking. Ansel looked at the trees for a long time. "You understand something about this place that I never had to learn," he said. "I grew up where trees were given. Forests stood before we arrived. Here you had to build them from scratch and defend them against everything: drought, wind, insects, cattle, fire, neighbors, merchants." He paused. "And time. Time is the hardest enemy. Most people cannot maintain belief in something that will not show results for 7 years. "I did not maintain belief," Beret said. "I maintained the rouse." Ansel almost smiled. His cough interrupted it. Spring of 1888 brought the first wave of community adoption. Beret visited 7 properties in March and April, surveying wind, marking stake lines, and teaching the cloth and compass method. Lydia accompanied her on 4 of the visits, not to learn the surveying. Lydia had no gift for spatial thinking and said so, but to teach route preparation. Lydia had studied Ansel's fanning technique during the summers she had brought her children to hoe the Weller shrub rows. She had paid more attention than Beret realized. She could trim a root ball, set the collar at grade, and shape a basin faster than Beret could because her hands were steadier and she did not waste motion on checking the compass. Kern contributed something unexpected. After his experience in the blizzard, he began insisting that every new windbreak include guide ropes and emergency passages. He had nearly died following an unmarked route through 0 visibility. He would not allow others to depend on a structure that could not be navigated blind. He demonstrated the point by having each new planter close their eyes, spin until disoriented, and then attempt to walk a straight line across their own property. None could. The point required no further argument. Kern strung rope between every major building on the properties he visited and insisted that the windbreak passages be wide enough for a stumbling person and angled to prevent wind channeling. This was Kern's conversion made practical. He did not praise the trees. He did not call Beret's method brilliant. He incorporated it into the safety infrastructure of the county the way he incorporated fence lines, fire breaks, and road markers. Pro because it worked, and because failing to account for it would kill people. Beret was careful with one element of the teaching that the outline had noted. She did not present the land as empty ground awaiting improvement. Every property she visited sat on prairie that had been used, traveled, and inhabited long before homesteaders arrived. The Pawnee and Lakota had shaped these grasslands through fire and use for generations. The sod houses and tree rows that settlers built replaced something rather than filling nothing. Beret acknowledged this in the same matter-of-fact way she acknowledged the wind. It was a condition of the place, not a sentiment about it. By midsummer, 11 new windbreaks were in their first planting season. Beret expected a 50% survival rate in year one. She told every family so. The losses were not failure. They were education. Each dead seedling taught something about the specific soil, moisture, and exposure of that particular site. The second planting would be better because the first planting had mapped the dangers. Ansel's lungs worsened through the summer and into autumn of 1888. The cough deepened. He walked shorter distances. He rested more frequently. On his visits to the Weller claim, which became monthly rather than weekly, he spent more time sitting on the south wall bench than walking the rows. In October, he noticed something that pleased him more than any measurement. Beret had changed the eastern arm without consulting him. She had extended it 30 feet south, at the 5-degree angle he had suggested. But she had also thinned the inner cedar row by removing 2 trees that had grown too dense and were creating a solid wall instead of a porous screen. She had replaced them with a staggered pair of younger cedars spaced to maintain 50% density as they matured. Ansel had not recommended the thinning. The density had been acceptable when he last inspected it. But Beret had watched the wind behavior through a spring storm and decided that the inner row was beginning to throw turbulence rather than bleed air. She had made the correction based on her own observation, her own judgment, and her own understanding of the principle he had taught her 7 years earlier. She expected him to question the decision. She had removed trees he had helped plant. She had altered a section of the design they had built together. Ansel looked at the gap where the 2 cedars had stood. He looked at the younger replacements in their staggered positions. He looked at the wind moving through the modified section, evenly, without eddies, without the sharp pressure changes that indicated turbulence. "You finally stopped building my windbreak," he said. It was the highest compliment he knew how to give. The design was no longer his instruction carried out by her hands. It was her design, maintained by her judgment, adapted by her understanding. He had taught her a principle. She had made it hers. Ansel visited 3 more times that autumn. Each visit was shorter. His breathing had become a sound Beret could hear from across the room, a thin wheeze beneath the conversation, like wind through a gap she could not close. In November, he told her that his tools should pass to her when the time came. The pruning saw, the survey chain, the brass compass. He did not say, "when I die." He said, "when the time comes." Beret did not argue with the phrasing. Ansel Maury died on the 14th of February, 1889, in the Broken Bow boarding house, with his hands folded on his chest and his window facing north, toward the open prairie where a line of trees he had helped shape stood dark against the winter sky. Beret received the tools the following day. She placed them in the drawer beside the stove. The pruning saw on the left, the chain coiled in the center, the brass compass on the right, next to Edwin's broken coat button. She buried Ansel in the town cemetery during a light snow. Kern attended. Lydia attended. Sloane did not. The grave faced west, toward the country where Ansel had spent his working life. The headstone was plain. Beret had paid for it from the season's egg money. After the burial, Beret walked back to the claim alone. The snow fell evenly across the open ground, covering the fences and the road and the dead grass in a white layer that erased every human mark. but along the windbreak's outer edge, a cedar twig caught in the fence wire moved without sound. The branches above it held their weight of snow. The spruce boughs overlapped at ground level, dense and dark and still. The trees did not know that the man who had taught their keeper how to keep them had stopped breathing that morning. They stood in their rows the way they had stood through every wind since they were tall enough to matter, holding their shape against the air, doing the work they had been planted to do. Beret passed through the western arm and walked to the cabin without looking back. The summer of 1890 was the driest Custer County had recorded since settlement. Rain fell twice in June, and not at all in July. The creek beds cracked. The grass turned the color of old rope and stood brittle enough to snap under a boot. Cattle lost weight. Wells dropped. The air smelled of dust and something older, the dry electric smell of grass waiting to burn. Sloan used the drought to advance a new argument. He had stopped mocking the windbreak after the blizzard. He could not deny the storm data, but fire was a different matter, and drought had handed him a weapon. He approached the subject at a town meeting in August, standing beside the stove in the schoolhouse, with the casual authority of a man who owned half the commercial buildings on the square. "We have all benefited from Mrs. Weller's trees," Sloan said. He used the word benefited the way a man uses a handkerchief, holding something unpleasant at a polite distance. But benefit in winter becomes danger in summer. A wall of conifers is a wall of fuel. One spark, one lightning strike, one careless fire, and every farmstead that planted behind those trees watches them burn, with the wind pushing the flames directly toward the buildings they were supposed to protect. It was a legitimate concern, and Barrett knew it. Ansel had known it. His fifth and final lesson had been about fire, the plowed mineral soil break, the removal of low dead branches, the maintenance of defensible space between the last tree and the nearest structure. Beret had maintained her fire break every year. She had cleared dead needles from beneath the cedars every autumn. She had pruned the lowest branches high enough that ground fire could not climb into the canopy. But not every new windbreak was maintained. 11 families had planted. Not all of them had followed the full protocol. 3 had let grass grow back to the base of their trees. 2 had never cleared dead needles. 1 had stacked firewood against the trunk of a cottonwood, creating a perfect ignition ladder from ground to canopy. Sloan was right that the community had a fire problem. He was wrong about the cause. The problem was not the trees. It was the maintenance. Beret stood at the meeting and said so. "The fire risk is real," she said, "but it exists because the maintenance has not been done. A tree with a 30-foot mineral break and pruned lower limbs does not carry a ground fire into its canopy. A tree surrounded by dry grass and dead needles does. The solution is not to cut the trees. It is to clear the ground." "And who will clear the ground?" Sloan asked. "Every property? Every year? You have given these people a chore that lasts forever." "Winter lasts forever," Beret said. "The wind does not stop. The maintenance does not stop. That is the cost." Sloan shook his head, but did not press further. He had planted his doubt. He could wait for the fire to prove it. He did not have to wait long. The prairie fire came from the west in the 3rd week of September, driven by a hot wind across miles of cured grass. The smoke appeared on the horizon at midday, a brown smudge that widened and darkened and began to move with the speed of a walking horse. Beret saw it from the cabin and calculated. The fire was approximately 4 miles west. The wind was blowing east at roughly 15 miles per hour. She had less than 20 minutes before the leading edge reached the Weller claim's western boundary. She had prepared for this. Every autumn since Ansel's death, she had plowed the 30-foot mineral soil break around the conifers. She had pruned the lowest cedar branches to a height of 4 feet, high enough that a grass fire passing beneath would not reach the canopy. She had cleared dead needles within the break. She had grazed the inner pocket short, but the outer shrub row, the plum and buffalo berry that formed the windward face, had grown dense and dry through the drought. The plum was woody and resinous. The buffalo berry had dead interior branches that had never been cleared. If the ground fire reached the shrub row with enough heat, it could ignite the dry interior growth and send flames upward into the cedar canopy. Beret made the decision in 60 seconds. She would sacrifice the outermost shrub section on the western arm. She took a hand scythe and began cutting the dry plum growth at ground level along a 100-foot stretch directly facing the approaching fire. She did not try to save the shrubs. She cut them flat, raked the cuttings onto the plowed break, and let them lie on bare mineral soil where they could burn without carrying heat to the trees behind them. Then she soaked cotton sacks in the water trough and hung them over the lowest cedar branches at the edge of the break, not to stop the fire, but to create a damp barrier that would resist ignition for the critical minutes when the fire front passed. 3 neighbors arrived. 2 had come to help. 1, Kern, had come to make sure she did not die trying to save trees. Kern positioned the helpers on the already blackened ground behind the fire line rather than ahead of it. This was Ansel's lesson, taught to Beret, now taught to Kern, now applied by Kern in the field. You do not stand in the path of a fire. You stand where it has already been and work from the safe side. The fire reached the western boundary at 2:15. The grass ignited in a continuous front, roughly a quarter-mile wide. The heat was visible, a shimmer above the orange line that made the air wobble. Burning debris flew ahead of the front in the wind, landing in unburned grass and starting spot fires 20 or 30 feet ahead of the main line. The plowed mineral break stopped the continuous front. Grass fires need grass. Where the soil was bare, the flame died at the edge, and the heat rolled over the break as hot air without fuel. The cut plum cuttings on the break caught fire and burned fast. Dry wood on bare soil, a quick flash that produced heat, but no advancing front. The wet cotton sacks on the cedar branches steamed and darkened, but did not ignite. One spot fire landed inside the break, a burning grasshopper carcass carried by wind, landing on a dry cedar needle that Beret had missed during her last clearing. The needle ignited. A 6-inch flame licked at the base of a cedar trunk. Kern stomped it out with his boot before it reached the bark. The main fire front passed the Weller claim in 11 minutes. It continued east across the open prairie, consuming grass, fences, and everything in its path that was not plowed, grazed, or wet. 2 miles east, the fire reached Sloane's tenant property. Sloane had planted a decorative row of mature cedars along the north side of the tenant house, tall, handsome trees that had never been pruned, never been cleared of dead growth, never had a fire break plowed around their base. The grass grew directly to their trunks. Dead branches hung to within 2 feet of the ground. The fire entered the cedar row at ground level and climbed. Within 90 seconds, the resinous branches were burning from root to tip. The heat exploded the sap in the trunks. The wind carried burning debris onto the roof of the north shed. The shed caught fire. By the time anyone could respond, the shed was lost. Sloane's decorative cedars burned to black skeletons. His north shed was ash. His tenant's fence line was gone for a quarter mile. Beret's shield lost its outermost plum shrubs along a 100-foot stretch of the western arm. The cedars behind them stood intact. The spruce behind the cedars showed no scorching. The cabin, the barn, the livestock, and the inner planting were untouched. The difference was 30 feet of bare soil and 4 feet of pruned clearance. If this story reminds you that preparation means maintaining what you build, not merely building it once, share it with someone who needs to hear that. Sloane's loss was public. The burned cedars stood beside the road where every wagon passed. The blackened shed foundation smoked for 2 days. The tenant, Amos Pell, the same man who had survived the blizzard by burrowing into hay, began looking for a new situation. He told anyone who asked that Sloane's property was not safe in any season. Sloane could no longer claim that Beret's method created fire risk. His own unmanaged planting had burned. Her managed shield had not. The evidence stood in charred and living wood on either side of the same road, separated by 2 miles and a philosophy of maintenance. But Sloane did not convert. Not yet. He shifted his tactics again, this time to quiet information gathering. He stopped mocking. He stopped threatening. He began asking questions, not of Beret, whom he would not approach directly, but of Kern. How wide was the fire break? How high were the lowest branches pruned? How often was the ground cleared? What species burned and what species resisted? Kern reported each conversation to Beret. He is learning through the back door, Kern said, too proud to walk through the front. Let him learn, Beret said. Pride is slow, but it is not permanent. She was wrong about that. Sloane's pride would hold for 2 more years, but the fire had cracked it. The blizzard had dented it. And the next crisis, one that Sloane could not survive alone, would finally break it open. The winter of 1889 to 1890 passed without major event. Beret burned 5 cords. The windbreak performed as designed. The damaged shrub section regrew from the roots. Plum and buffalo berry regenerated aggressively from established root systems, and by the second spring after the fire, the western face was dense again. Beret refined the teaching method. She had watched the 11 first-year windbreaks through their initial seasons and cataloged the failures. 3 families had planted 2 dense, solid walls that threw turbulence rather than bleeding wind. 2 had placed their barriers too close to the house, producing the drift on the door problem that Kern had originally predicted. 1 had left a wagon lane running straight through the barrier, aligned with the house's front door, creating a wind tunnel that concentrated the blast instead of dispersing it. Beret redesigned the teaching version of the layout with these failures in mind. She built 3 demonstration panels on the Weller claim, 1 sparse, 1 at 50% density, 1 solid boughs, and had every new student walk behind each panel during a wind. The sparse panel let too much through. The student felt the wind almost undiminished. The dense panel threw the wind over the top and pulled it down behind. The student felt a turbulent eddy that changed direction unpredictably. The 50% panel bled the wind through evenly. The student felt a steady, slow movement of air without force. The difference was not theoretical, it was physical. The student felt it on their face and did not need to be told which design was correct. Do not build a wall, Beret told every student. Build a filter. The wind must pass through. It must leave its speed on the way. She emphasized the 5 principles she had learned from Ansel, practiced for 7 years, and distilled into rules she could teach in an afternoon. 1. The barrier must face the dangerous wind, not the compass. Every property had a different answer. The cloth test found it. 2. The ends must extend past the protected building. A barrier that stops short leaves the wind a path around the edge. 3. Density must be controlled, 50 to 60%, not a wall. 4. A separate snow-catching row must stand far enough from roofs and doors that the heaviest drift falls in the field, not on the threshold. 5. A plowed or grazed firebreak must surround mature conifers. The protection does not stop. The maintenance does not stop. Kern added a sixth principle. Every windbreak must include guide ropes and marked passages for navigation in zero visibility. Trees that protected a building in the wind must also guide people to the building when they could not see it. Lydia added a seventh. Keep written records. Record what dies and why. Record fuel use every winter. Record drift locations after every storm. The numbers prove the method. The numbers also reveal when the method needs adjustment. The teaching program grew through 1890 and 1891. Beret visited properties as far as 15 miles from the Weller claim. She never charged for the site survey. She gave away cottonwood cuttings and plum suckers from her own stock. She sold purchased spruce and cedar at cost. The only payment she asked was the maintenance commitment, the fire break, the pruning, the clearing, the written record. Some families kept the commitment, some did not. Beret could not force them. She could only demonstrate year after year that the maintained windbreak worked, and the neglected windbreak eventually created the exact problem its critics had predicted. The distinction became her most persistent lesson. The trees did not protect the house, the maintained trees protected the house. The unmaintained trees were furniture for the wind and fuel for the fire. By the spring of 1891, 23 farmsteads in the dramatized Custer County network had windbreaks in various stages of growth. Beret and Lydia had begun operating what they called a nursery, though it was less formal than the word implied. 12 beds of seedlings on the south side of the Weller claim, sheltered by the windbreak itself, producing several thousand cuttings and starts each year. The railroad had lowered the cost of hardier nursery stock from suppliers in eastern Nebraska and Iowa. Black Hills spruce that had cost Beret nearly $1 per seedling in 1881 now arrived for a fraction of that amount. Red cedar remained cheap because Beret rooted her own cuttings from the mature trees on the claim. Lydia handled the practical economics, tracking which families needed replacement stock, which had paid for purchase trees, which owed labor in exchange for free cuttings. Beret handled the site work, surveying new properties, inspecting existing windbreaks, marking failures, and recommending corrections. They did not divide the work by agreement. They divided it by competence. Lydia was better with numbers and people. Beret was better with wind and wood. Neither pretended to the other's strength. The partnership functioned without sentiment. Lydia still believed Beret carried water when she should have been fixing fence. Beret still believed Lydia counted buckets when she should have been counting winters. They argued about priorities at least once a month, usually beside the nursery beds, usually while working. The arguments ended the same way. Lydia conceded the trees were necessary. Beret conceded the fence was overdue, and both went back to whatever they had been doing. It was not friendship in the way the word is usually meant. It was something more durable, a working relationship between two women who respected each other's judgment enough to disagree with it openly and continue working anyway. Sloan, watching from the commercial distance of his store counter, saw the nursery expand and understood that Beret was building something more dangerous to his interests than a windbreak. She was building an institution. A woman who gave away trees and taught their placement for free was a woman whose influence grew with every planting season. Every farmstead she helped was a farmstead that owed her nothing except gratitude and the willingness to listen when she spoke at a meeting. Sloan could not compete with free. He could not undercut a price of zero. He could not offer a better product because the product was knowledge, and Beret's knowledge was proven while his was theoretical. He had one remaining advantage. He had not yet asked for help, and until he did, he could still claim independence from the widow whose land he had once expected to own. That advantage had 2 years left. In the autumn of 1892, Merritt Sloan's daughter Clara moved into his northern house with her infant granddaughter. Clara's husband had died of typhoid in Grand Island that August. She arrived in Broken Bow with a trunk, a 7-month-old child, and nowhere else to go. Sloane installed them in the house he had built on his northern quarter section, a well-framed, well-roofed building with tight joints and a good stove. It was, by every measure except one, the best-built house in the township. It faced the open prairie to the north, without a single tree between its walls and the wind. Sloane had never planted a windbreak on the northern property. He had planted the decorative cedar row on the tenant house. The row that burned, but decorative planting was vanity, not engineering. He had never surveyed wind. He had never measured drift patterns. He had never tied a cloth to a stake and watched which direction the prairie wanted to kill from. He did what men of means do when they decide trees are the answer. He ordered 200 cedars from a nursery in Lincoln, hired 2 men to dig holes, and planted them in a solid double row 15 feet from the north wall of the house. The trees arrived in October. They were planted in November. They were 3 feet tall, spaced 4 feet apart in 2 parallel lines with the trunks offset. A pattern that would, within 5 years, produce a wall of green so dense that light could not pass through it. Sloane had built exactly what Beret had spent 7 years teaching people not to build. The first snowstorm arrived in early December. It was not severe, a 25-mile-per-hour wind from the north-northwest with moderate snowfall, the kind of event that occurred 4 or 5 times each winter. The solid double row caught every particle of driven snow and dumped it directly behind the trees, which meant directly against the north wall of the house. By morning, a drift 4 feet deep pressed against the rear door. The door could not open outward. Snow had packed into the gap between the door and the frame, hard enough that even pulling it inward required Clara to chip ice with a kitchen knife. The wind that cleared the top of the solid tree row descended on the roof with turbulence the open prairie had never produced. The stovepipe, which had drawn cleanly for years on the exposed house, began pulling sideways. Smoke leaked into the upper room where the baby slept. Clara carried the child downstairs and opened a window, in December saisons, to clear the air. The house that had been adequate without trees was now worse with them. Sloane inspected the damage the following day. He saw the drift against the wall. He saw the scour marks on the roof where turbulent wind had stripped loose shingles. He saw the ice packed into the door frame. He stood in his own yard and understood in the physical evidence of snow and wind and wood every principle Beret had tried to teach the county for 7 years. A solid wall throws the wind over the top and pulls it down behind. The drift lands at the base of the wall, not in the field. The turbulence disrupts the chimney draw. The protection that was supposed to shelter the house attacks it instead. Sloane could have hired the same 2 men to remove the trees. He could have returned to the exposed condition that had at least been predictable. He could have done what he had done with every other setback, absorbed the cost privately and maintained his public position. But Clara was inside that house, and the baby was inside that house. And the winter had 4 months remaining. He came to the Weller claim after dark. Beret was reading by lamplight beside the stove. She heard the horse and opened the door to find Sloane standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. She had never seen him hold his hat. In every previous encounter, the debt negotiation, the boundary confrontation, the store counter, the town meeting, the hat had stayed on. It was armor. He had removed it. "Mrs. Weller," he said, "I need your help." Beret stood in the doorway and waited. She did not invite him in. She did not refuse him. She waited. "My daughter is in the north house. The baby is 7 months old. I planted trees the wrong way, and the first storm put 4 feet of snow against the back door and smoke in the room where the child sleeps." He said it all at once, as if the words would lose their courage if he paused. "Tell me what to cut," he said. Beret looked at him for a long time. This was the man who had waited beside the county clerk's door while Edwin's bloody coat was returned. The man who had taken their horse as security before the body was cold. The man who had posted her debt on the store wall. The man who had offered to buy her claim for a fraction of its value 3 times in 7 years. The man who had called her planting the widow's funnel and encouraged every snicker that followed. He was standing in her yard in the dark because his granddaughter was sleeping in a house he had made dangerous through the exact ignorance he had refused to correct when Beret offered to correct it. She could have turned him away. She had earned the right. "First, tell me what you need protected," Beret said. "My family," Sloane said. "Then we begin with the wind, not the trees." Beret visited Sloane's northern property the following morning. She brought the brass compass, a length of red cloth, and 20 stakes. She tied the cloth to a stake in the open ground north of the tree row and watched it snap horizontal in a light morning breeze, north-northwest, the same dominant wind direction as the Weller claim, because the properties were 2 miles apart on the same open plain. She walked the solid double row and cataloged the damage. The drift against the north wall measured 3 feet 8 inches at its deepest point from a single moderate storm. A severe event would double or triple the accumulation. The snow had already begun to melt against the foundation, wetting the sill boards. By spring, the wood would rot if the pattern continued. The turbulence over the roof had deposited a secondary drift on the south side of the house, a paradox that Sloane had not expected. The wind, thrown upward by the solid barrier, descended on the far side of the building and deposited snow where the southern exposure should have kept the ground clear. The stovepipe showed soot streaks where backdraft had pushed smoke downward into the flue during the wind event. Beret made Sloane walk the full perimeter with her. She did not lecture. She pointed to each piece of evidence and asked him to describe what he saw. Snow against the wall. Why? Because the trees caught it. Where did you want the snow? Sloane paused. He had not considered the question. He had planted the trees to stop the wind. He had not thought about where the snow would go after the wind was stopped. Not here, he said. Then the catching row must stand further from the house. 30 feet minimum. 40 is better. The snow falls where the wind loses its last speed. If the trees are 15 feet from the wall, the snow falls on the wall. If the trees are 40 feet from the wall, the snow falls in the yard. I cannot move 200 trees. You do not move them. You remove one row entirely and thin the other to half its current density. Sloane stared at her. She was telling him to destroy more than half of what he had planted. You built a wall, Beret said. A wall throws the wind over the top and brings it down behind, on your roof, on your door, on your chimney. You need a filter, 50 to 60% density. The wind must pass through. It must leave its force inside the trees, not carry it over the top and deliver it to the building. She marked the trees for removal with strips of cloth. Sloane watched the red marks appear on trunk after trunk. 93 trees, more than a third of his planting. You are also too close, Beret said. The remaining row needs a second row added 40 feet north with shrubs at 50 feet. The shrubs catch the heaviest snow far from the house. The tree row slows the wind that gets past the shrubs. The house receives what is left, which, if the density is correct, is not enough to push smoke down a chimney or pack a drift against a door. Sloane looked at the marked trees. Each one had cost him money. Each one had been planted by hired labor. Each one was a visible commitment that the town had seen him make. Removing them was not merely correction. It was public admission that the widow had been right and the merchant had been wrong. When do I cut them? Sloane asked. Today, Beret said, before the next storm. Sloane cut them himself. He did not hire the work. He took an axe and a bow saw and spent 2 days removing 93 cedars from the row while Clara watched from the kitchen window with the baby on her hip. The physical labor was Sloane's conversion, not the data, not the argument, not the burned cedars or the blizzard account or the town meeting debate about fire. The axe in his hands, cutting down trees he had paid for and planted wrong on ground he owned to protect a granddaughter who would not survive a winter in the house he had built for her. He dug beside the woman whose land he had once expected to own. He followed her marks. He removed what she told him to remove. He asked questions. How far apart? How much to thin? Which branches to prune? How deep to plow the fire break? He wrote the answers in the same ledger he used for store accounts, in the same careful hand, with the same attention to numbers. Beret did not humiliate him. She did not reference the debt, the mockery, the offers, the posted note, the years of obstruction. She treated him the way Ansel had treated her, as someone whose willingness to learn was more important than the years they had spent refusing to. Sloane planted the shrub row at 50 feet in March. He added a second tree row at 40 feet with stock from Beret's nursery. He plowed the fire break himself, walking behind his own horse, turning 30 feet of sod in a ring around his daughter's house. The next winter storm deposited the heaviest drift 35 feet north of the house, in the open ground between the shrub row and the remaining tree line. The door opened freely. The chimney drew straight. The baby's room held no smoke. At the next public meeting, Sloane stood and said what he had come to say. I planted 200 trees in a double row 15 feet from the house. The first storm buried the door, filled the upstairs with smoke, and nearly drove my daughter back to a town she came to me to escape. He paused. The room was quiet in the same way it had been quiet for Kern, not from sympathy, but from the weight of a proud man paying something visible. Mrs. Weller told me to remove half and move the rest. I did it. The second winter was the proof. My first planting failed because I ignored her plan. I built a wall when I needed a filter. It was grudging. It was not warm. It contained no apology and no reference to the years of damage he had inflicted. But it was unambiguous. Every person in the room heard Merritt Sloane credit Beret Weller's method, by name, in a public forum, after 12 years of opposition. Beret, sitting in the back row, said nothing. Kern, sitting beside her, leaned over and said quietly, "That is the hardest cord of wood he has ever split." By 1895, the operation had outgrown the Weller claim. Beret and Lydia maintained 12 nursery beds, producing several thousand seedlings and cuttings annually. The beds occupied the south side of the windbreak, where the shelter zone created a microclimate warm enough to start tender stock 3 weeks earlier than exposed ground. 46 farmsteads in the dramatized network had windbreaks in various stages, from first-year plantings barely visible above the grass to 7-year installations approaching functional height. The designs varied. Some used Beret's chevron for properties with 2 dominant wind directions. Others used single straight barriers for properties with 1 clear threat. Several had added secondary rows to protect barns, livestock yards, or access roads. No 2 were identical. That was the point. The railroad continued lowering the cost of nursery stock, but the local operation kept the program affordable for families who could not pay cash. Beret accepted labor in exchange for trees. 2 days of hoeing the nursery beds earned a season's worth of replacement stock. She accepted eggs, flour, and fence posts. She accepted from one family the loan of a draft horse for 3 weeks during planting season. The only thing she did not accept was neglect. When a family failed to maintain their fire break for 2 consecutive seasons, Beret stopped supplying replacement stock until the break was plowed. When a family let cattle into their tree rows, she told them plainly that she would not replace what they had allowed to be destroyed. "I will give you trees," she said. I will not give you trees twice for the same mistake. It was harsh. Several families resented it, but the standard held, and the maintained windbreaks survived. A typical day on the Weller claim in 1895 showed the operation at its working rhythm. Morning, Beret walked the windbreak. She checked for broken branches, loose guide ropes, low gaps in the shrub layer, and any sign of disease or insect damage. The walk took 40 minutes and had not been skipped in 14 years. Mid-morning, nursery work. Lydia managed the beds, watering, weeding, thinning, and sorting stock by size and health. 2 neighbor children earned their family's tree allotment by hoeing rows after school. Midday. Beret surveyed a new property 4 miles north. The owner wanted protection for a new barn. Beret tied the cloth, took compass readings, and told him to watch for a week. Afternoon, Kern arrived to string guide ropes on a 2-year windbreak that had reached passage height. He brought wire, stakes, and the same blunt manner he brought to everything. Evening. Beret updated the maintenance ledger. 46 properties, each with a planting date, species list, survival count, fuel use record, and firebreak inspection date. The ledger occupied 3 notebooks. It was the most complete windbreak performance record in the county, and Beret kept it not because anyone required it, but because Lydia had told her 7 years ago to write everything down. The numbers proved the method. Winter after winter, the maintained windbreaks reduced fuel consumption by roughly 1/4 to 1/3. Houses behind functional barriers held warmer interior temperatures during storms. Chimneys drew cleaner. Drift patterns were predictable and manageable. Livestock survived in sheltered yards that would have killed exposed animals. The numbers also revealed the failures. Windbreaks planted too dense performed worse than no windbreak at all. Barriers placed too close to buildings created the problems Kern had originally predicted. Gaps left unrepaired channeled and accelerated wind. Unmaintained shrub rows became fire hazards. Beret published none of this. She shared it with anyone who asked. The ledger sat on the table beside the stove, next to the drawer that held Ansel's compass, Edwin's button, and the pruning saw that had outlasted the man who carried it. Beret and Lydia's partnership deepened through the 90s, not through affection, but through dependence. Each needed what the other provided, and neither pretended otherwise. Lydia managed the human side of the operation, scheduling property visits, tracking who owed labor, mediating disputes between neighbors whose windbreaks overlapped or whose drift patterns interfered with each other's fields. She had a gift for practical diplomacy that Beret entirely lacked. Beret could tell a man his windbreak was wrong. Lydia could tell a man his windbreak was wrong and leave him feeling he had discovered the problem himself. Beret managed the technical side, surveying, designing, inspecting, correcting. She trained 3 younger farmers to conduct basic site assessments, but she continued doing the complex work herself. Properties with irregular terrain, multiple buildings, or competing wind directions required the kind of spatial thinking that could not be taught from a demonstration panel. It had to be felt. Standing in the wind, watching the cloth, imagining the air moving over and through and around the barriers in 3 dimensions. No romantic partnership arrived. No suitor appeared at the door. No gentle widower rode in from the next county to recognize Beret's worth and offer her a future that included someone else's last name. This was not an omission. It was a choice, both Beret's and the story's. The narrative did not require a marriage to resolve a widow's arc. Beret's life had been shaped by 2 partnerships, with Ansel, who taught her the principle, and with Lydia, who helped her spread it. Both were collaborations between unequal but mutually respectful people. Both produced something that neither partner could have built alone. The absence of romance was not loneliness. Beret's days were full. Her evenings were occupied. Her purpose was clear. She lived in the cabin Edwin had built, behind the trees she and Ansel had planted, surrounded by a community that had once mocked her work and now depended on it. She was not waiting for someone. She was already doing the things she was meant to do. The years compressed the way years do when the daily rhythm holds steady. Beret completed ownership of the Weller claim in 1884, 5 years of continuous residence, proved and filed. She cleared the final debt to Sloan in 1890, paying the last $41 from nursery income. Sloan recorded the payment without comment. The note that had hung on his store wall for a decade came down and went into a drawer. She converted the original cabin into a teaching room. The walls that had leaked wind in 1880 still stood, now sealed and banked and surrounded by trees tall enough to break the skyline. The stove remained. The table remained. The drawer beside the stove held what it had always held. Kern retired from the sheriff's office in 1893 and became the cooperative's bluntest safety lecturer. He visited new windbreaks with a notebook and a manner that had not softened with age. He tested guide ropes by pulling on them. He measured fire breaks with a chain. He told every new planter the same story: the ride through the blizzard, the horse refusing, the walk through the open wind, and the moment the western arm changed the air. "I am alive because those trees were there," Kern told them, "and I am here because I did not believe they would be." He never became Beret's friend. He became something more useful, a credible witness, a man who had publicly doubted, publicly tested, and publicly converted. His authority rested not on faith in the method, but on having been wrong about it and surviving the education. Sloan never became Beret's friend either. After the public admission, he stopped obstructing. He supplied nursery stock through his store at a reduced price. Not charity, but good business, since the windbreak program increased the value of every property in his trading area. He maintained his own planting. He plowed his own fire break. He pruned his own cedars. He did not apologize. He did not revisit the debt, the offers, the mockery, or the years of pressure. He simply stopped doing those things and began doing others. The change was visible to everyone and discussed by no one, because the community understood that Sloan's pride was a structure as carefully maintained as any windbreak, and pointing out the cracks would not improve its function. Beret accepted the truce for what it was. She had never needed Sloan's friendship. She had needed his opposition to end. It had ended. That was enough. By the turn of the century, the first cottonwoods on the Weller claim began to decline. Cottonwood is a fast-growing tree with a moderate lifespan. The specimens Beret had planted as 18-inch cuttings in 1881 were now 20 years old and showing signs of age. Dead branches in the upper canopy, hollow sections in the largest trunks, bark splitting along the south-facing sides where sun and frost worked in alternation. The cottonwoods had served their purpose. They had provided height and structural depth during the critical growing years when the evergreens were too small to matter. They had broken the upper wind column while the cedars and spruce handled the lower, but their job was ending. Beret taught the younger farmers who had joined the program how to replace declining roughs in stages. Never remove an entire generation at once. Take every other tree in one season. Let the gaps fill with the growth of the neighbors. Take the remaining old trees the following season. Plant replacements in the new gaps while the surviving trees continue working. The principle was the same one that governed the entire windbreak. The shield must never develop a catastrophic gap. Not in a single storm. Not in a single season. Not in a single generation of trees. The trees you plant today will protect your grandchildren's house, Beret told one young farmer, but only if someone replaces them before they fall. The wind does not wait. The maintenance does not wait. If you let the shield die of old age without replacement, you will discover that the wind remembers every opening you gave it. She said this standing in her own windbreak, where the spruce and cedar now stood 20 and 30 feet tall, their branches interlocking, their trunks thick enough that a man could not wrap his arms around the largest cedars. The plum suckers had spread into a dense hedge along both arms. The buffalo berry had recovered from the fire and filled every gap in the outer face. The windbreak was 20 years old. It had survived drought, grasshoppers, hail, cattle, fire, and the worst blizzard in the region's recorded history. It would survive another 20 years if it was maintained, another 40 if the declining rows were replaced. It was not a monument, it was a living machine. And like all machines, it required attention. Beret gave it attention every morning of every year she remained on the claim, the walk, the inspection, the pruning saw in hand when a branch hung low enough to touch the snow, the compass in her pocket when a new property needed surveying. She grew older in the way people grow old who work outside every day. Her hands thickened, her shoulders rounded slightly from years of carrying the water yoke. The bruised ribs that had never fully healed left a stiffness on her left side that worsened in cold weather. Her hair went gray at the temples first, then entirely, and she wore it pulled back in the same way she had worn it since the morning she drove the first stake. She did not slow down. She walked the windbreak at the same pace at 60 that she had at 31. The trees were taller. The distance was the same. The wind had not changed. The closing of Beret Weller's working life was not a single event, but a gradual transfer. By 1905, 3 trained surveyors conducted site assessments across the county. Lydia's records filled 7 notebooks. Kern, too old to ride but not too old to argue, held court beside the stove in Beret's teaching room and told every new student that he had once predicted the trees would bury the house. "I was wrong," he said every time with the same flat delivery. "And I have spent 15 years making sure no one else is wrong the same way." Beret remained on the Weller claim. She kept Ansel's tools in the drawer. She kept Edwin's button beside them. She did not sentimentalize either object. They were simply there, the way the trees were there, the way the wind was there, permanent conditions of a life that had been shaped by what it lost and what it built in response. Her most meaningful habit in later years was the one she had maintained since the first cedar reached functional height. After every hard wind, she walked the shield. She looked for broken limbs. She checked for low gaps where the shrubs had thinned. She examined the density of the evergreen rows for places where growth had closed the porosity too tightly and needed thinning. The method remained alive because she never treated it as finished. A wall could be built and left. A living windbreak could not. It grew. It changed. It responded to drought and age and wind and fire. It required judgment, the same judgment Ansel had recognized in a young woman sorting dead seedlings by cause at an Arbor Day gathering 24 years earlier. The judgment could be taught. The patience could not. Beret had carried water for 7 years before the trees repaid a single bucket. She had endured mockery, isolation, debt, and the physical cost of labor that would have broken most people twice over. She had done it not because she believed the trees would save her. Belief was too fragile a word for what sustained her, but because the arithmetic left no alternative. The trees were the only answer that got stronger instead of weaker. Everything else she had tried, the sod banking, the rag chinking, the hauled deadfall, the sleeping beside the stove, had consumed itself in the using. Every cord burned was a cord gone. Every winter took more than it left. The trees gave back. They grew. They accumulated. They compounded their protection with each ring of wood added to their trunks. Each branch extended into the wind. Each root driven deeper into soil that held them against forces that had torn roofs from buildings and frozen cattle where they stood. Bray understood compound returns. She had simply applied them to wood and wind instead of money and interest. The investment was water. The interest was shelter. The maturity date was 7 years. And the principal never depleted. 46 farmsteads used plans derived from Beret-Weller's measurements by 1895. None copied the original chevron exactly. Some used one straight barrier where the wind came from a single quarter. Others used 2 rows at different angles for properties exposed to shifting storms. 3 used 4-sided enclosures for livestock yards, where the wind changed direction seasonally. The shared principle was consistent across every design. Identify the dangerous wind, slow it over depth, control where the snow falls, keep the barrier continuous, maintain it. One specific legacy detail survived longer than the windbreaks themselves. Each family received a short length of red cloth to tie to a stake before planting. They had to watch it through several winds before digging the first hole. The cloth was Beret's compass, cheaper than brass, available to anyone and impossible to argue with. The wind told the truth. The cloth showed it. No expertise was necessary, only patience. Beret-Weller remained on the Weller claim into old age. She kept Ansel's brass compass in the same drawer as Edwin's broken coat button. She walked the windbreak every morning until her legs would not carry her through the full perimeter, and then she walked half of it and sent a neighbor's child to walk the other half and report. She died in the cabin Edwin had built. The stove was warm, the north wall was dry. The thermometer beside the table read 68 degrees on a January night when the open prairie stood at 9 below. The open prairie on the 12th of January, 1888, had carried snow sideways at 56 miles per hour. Kern had bent forward beneath a wind he could not face. He had ridden south because he expected to find a door frozen shut and a widow dead beside an exhausted stove. He had predicted it. The county had expected it. Merritt Sloan had planned for it. Kern had told her 7 years before the blizzard. Standing beside the stake line, she had driven into frozen ground with a post maul and bruised ribs and $41 to her name. Trees that close will bury the house before they save it. The trees did not stop the blizzard. They did not warm the iron stove or create heat from frozen ground. They did something less dramatic and more lasting. They forced the moving air to surrender part of its speed before it reached the walls. They caught the heaviest snow and held it in the field. They turned a 56-mile-per-hour killing wind into a current that a man could stand upright inside and a woman could walk through to find her neighbor crawling in the dark. The final image is the cabin seen from the north after a winter snow. A long white drift lies harmlessly beyond the outer shrubs, undisturbed and clean. The spruce branches carry ice. The cedar trunks stand dark against the gray sky. Smoke rises nearly straight from the chimney inside the sheltered pocket, bending only slightly where the upper wind catches it above the tree line. Behind the trees, the thermometer beside Beret-Weller's coffee reads 75 degrees.